Chapter 258. In the end, Fan Xian just smiled without a trace of arrogance. He was extremely sincere, playing his part as a brother-in-law, and putting in the capital of an official. He let the surrounding officials see. Who would have thought that this matter of fighting for passage and offending people had come from his brain? Fan Xian was born with a set of advantages. As the saying goes, one cannot be a bad person. It could also be considered the path of a treacherous thief. He was very willing to offend and bully people behind their backs, but on the surface, he was very willing to give in. This was the way to truly reap benefits. For example, the eldest princess had been tricked by him several times, and forced out of the palace by letters. But to this day, she still did not know that the mastermind behind the scenes was her son-in-law. She thought that this son-in-law would only suffer in silence, and would still listen to her in the north, not daring to turn against her. He had always believed in one thing. It was good to be flamboyant and arrogant, but he had to be low-key flamboyant and eat pork in silence. It was said that those who could be moved must be moved, and those who could not be moved at the moment, he would not move even if you beat him to death. Naturally, the great prince was someone he could not touch at the moment, but today, he just had to fight with the great prince. This was already a great rebellion. Naturally, no one knew that he was doing this purely for the emperor in the palace to see. The great prince, who had a straightforward personality, was, without a doubt, the best acting target. Perhaps only Chen Ping, that old fox, could guess a little of this. In the end, under the mediation of the crown prince, the two sides came to a compromise. The vanguard of the diplomatic mission and the great prince's personal army entered the capital together. But this was not in accordance with the rules, and made the director of the Board of Rites angry. It made the face of Taichung Temple full of fear. How to arrange the guards of honor became a big problem. The crown prince looked at Fan Xian and did not say anything, but he did not know where he came from. He pretended to scold him. "You are also making trouble." It was clearly agreed that the diplomatic mission would arrive in the capital the day after tomorrow. "Why did you suddenly arrive early? You left the court with no arrangements, and caused all this to happen." Fan Xian smiled. "I am also in a hurry to go home. Your Highness, please forgive me this time. Who knows if there will be an imperial censor who will accuse me tomorrow." In fact, he also felt strange in his heart. After not seeing him for a few months, the Eastern Palace Master's complexion was much better than before. The slight timidity and gloom were no longer there, and his face was glowing. He did not know what good news he had received. Of course, he did not know that after the eldest princess left the royal palace and returned to Xinjiang, one of the two mountains that had always been pressing down on the crown prince had suddenly disappeared. His mood immediately brightened, and in addition to the emperor's many comforting edicts, the crown prince's days were much better than before. In the hearts of the officials, they always thought that the crown prince had it easy, and the second prince must not be too comfortable. But at the city gate, when the crowd looked at the second prince, who was in the tent preparing to welcome the great prince back to the capital, they did not see a trace of unease on the face of this elegant nobleman. Instead, it was the young fellow by his side that attracted even more attention. This was the emperor's youngest son. The emperor had given birth to a total of 4 sons. The crown prince was not one of them, so this was the third prince, who had been raised deep in the palace. This year, he was only 9 years old. This time, when the great prince returned to the capital, the emperor had ordered all the princes in the capital to come out and welcome him. This was a show of respect. At the same time, this young prince, who had never appeared in front of the court officials, had his first opportunity to make an official appearance. The second prince held the young prince's hand and bowed to the great prince. The great prince seemed to have a good relationship with the second prince. He stepped forward and gave him a bear hug, then rubbed the little fellow's head. In a rough voice he said, "How did you grow so tall?" The little fellow giggled, and his face revealed an innocent expression. He replied, "In the future when I grow as tall as you, I will go out and fight the Hu people." This young prince's birth mother was a sister of the Fan Manor's Lady Lu, so in a roundabout way, he was somewhat related to Fan Xian. But when Fan Xian looked at this young and beautiful young prince and saw the innocent smile on his face, his heart skipped a beat. He saw a trace of self-control in his innocent smile that did not match his age. Involuntarily, a slight smile rose to the corner of his mouth. He thought to himself, "I have been pretending to be innocent and bashful since I was young. How dare you play this trick in front of me?" Fan Xian really is selling a smile without knowing it. Naturally, The second prince also knew what had happened earlier. He smiled bitterly at Fan Xian.
I say, brother-in-law, I think all the officials in the capital should thank the heavens and earth if you can make less trouble one day.
Fan Xian's smile seemed even more bitter than a gold thread.
He explained, it is really the princess of Northern Qi's will.
I am just a mere official in Enji. How could I be so daring? The crown prince frowned imperceptibly, as if displeased with the second prince's tone of voice when he spoke to Fan Xian.
He said lightly, Second brother, the ceremony is not finished.
Let us address each other by official rank. This was a bit unreasonable. Earlier, the crown prince of the Eastern Palace had called Fan Xian brother-in-law, quite affectionately. But now he refused to let the second prince call him that. The second prince's expression was as usual. He chuckled and made a sound of acknowledgement. He moved closer to Fan Xian and lowered his voice. Before the spring examination, I told you to go back to the manor and ask Channer what she called me. Did you ask her? Only now did Fan Xian remember that matter. He shook his head and smiled. Your Highness also knows that something happened during the spring examination. I forgot for a moment.
Today, when I return to the manor, I will ask her.
The second prince smiled and said nothing more. He took the third prince's hand and followed the crown prince and the great prince in front of them toward the city gate. Although the two of them spoke in low voices, it still reached the great prince's ears. This prince, who had spent many years on campaigns outside, could not help but have many doubts in his heart. Although he knew of Fan Xian's reputation, he was not in the capital, so he did not know what kind of power Fan Xian held in his hands.
At this moment, he was shocked to find that whether it was the second prince or the crown prince, their words were very gentle toward Fan Xian.
It was as if they were afraid that the officials present did not know that they had a very close relationship with Fan Xian. A mere official was valued so highly by the two sons of the imperial family that they were willing to lower their status. The great prince could not help but furrow his brows and feel a bit unhappy. Fan Xian, on the other hand, had other thoughts. He looked at the four princes in front of him, dressed in bright yellow and plain yellow, walking toward the pitch-black city gate. For a moment, he was somewhat absent-minded. He wondered if there would come a day when he would stand among these four brothers. Autumn in the capital was indescribably beautiful. The sky was high and the clouds were light.
The yellowing leaves drooped by the side of the houses, unwilling to be rushed into the water.
The flowing water by the side of the street was inevitably a bit lonely.
At the end of the long street, a corner of the distant eaves of the palace occasionally peeked out, hanging in the blue sky, displaying its majesty. The great prince's entourage had long since left with a lingering anger, but the envoys' carriages deliberately slowed down.
Accompanied by a group of officials from the Chamberlain of Dependencies and Taichung Temple, they slowly made their way to the palace. Since they had already entered the capital, Fan Xian was no longer in a hurry. In any case, he could not go home immediately. He had to go to the palace gate to reply to the edict, so he finally had some spare time to look around. Although he had only been in the capital for a year and was far less familiar with it than he was with Danzhou, for some reason, as soon as he entered, he saw the houses all around him, and smelled the unique smells of the capital. Fan Xian felt refreshed. Sir, you are in a hurry to return to the capital. There must be something at home.
The voice of the princess of Northern Qi floated out from the carriage next to the steed.
Fan Xian smiled, but did not reply. He knew that she was deliberately trying to befriend this seemingly ordinary, but actually important official. But along the way, the two of them had communicated enough. Now that he was in the capital, he had many eyes and ears around him. It was best to avoid this last encounter. Furthermore, the princess had guessed what he was thinking, but he did not know how to respond. The Fan family was now very popular in the capital, and the entire household was safe. No one knew why he was in such a hurry. He urged the horse forward, coming to the side of Yan Bingyun's carriage.
In a low voice he said, "You must take her with you if you don't want to cause me trouble."
Inside the carriage, Yan Bingyun shook his head. He looked at Lady Shen, who he had tied up securely, but who still stared fiercely at him with those familiar eyes. He did not understand when Sir Fan had developed the hobby of being a matchmaker. He sighed and changed the subject. Sir, today's struggle over the road was not a wise decision. The Overwatch Council has always been neutral in the struggle between the princes.
Sir once said, and what I heard has been confirmed, that the Crown Prince and the Second Prince both have expectations of you.
Since this is the case, for the sake of fairness, You should not provoke the great prince. This is unavoidably contrary to the purpose of the council. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that what Yan Bingyun said made sense. As an official of the kingdom of Qing, especially the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he would either never have any dealings with the princes, or if he did, he would have to be impartial. Otherwise, the palace would be convinced that the Overwatch Council would not favor any of the princes. But Fan Xian could not do that, because he knew that his identity was not as simple as that of an official. If he was biased towards the princes, it would at most make His Majesty suspect that he was planning for power and riches in the future. He would never be as loyal as Chen Pingping. But if he were to be impartial, he feared that His Majesty would suspect that he was not willing to be an official. This was Fan Xian's greatest fear. The carriages arrived at Qingdao Square. There was no longer a need for the bailiffs of the capital government to maintain order, because they had arrived at a relatively quiet place where the officials lived. Naturally, there were not as many commoners standing on the side of the street watching the commotion. At this moment, one of the carriages broke away from the main group and quietly drove into an alley on the side of the street. Someone could faintly be seen inside to receive it. Although it was quiet, in reality, there were naturally court officials who saw it clearly. They knew that the composition of the diplomatic mission was complicated, and that it was probably the work of the Overwatch Council. Looking at Fan Xian's serious expression, no one dared to ask too much. Fan Xian's expression was naturally serious, because they were about to reach the royal palace, and the vermilion palace walls were right in front of them. A group of members of the diplomatic mission waited outside the palace gates. The imperial power was majestic, and naturally no one dared to relax their appearance. It was just that they had traveled thousands of miles, and inevitably it was tiring. After waiting for a long time, there was still no edict. The officials all felt a little uneasy, but they thought about how this diplomatic mission to northern Qi had carved out a lot of territory for the royal court. Furthermore, Fan Xian had made a great show of face in the northern Qi royal court. That carriage of old books did not seem to be worth much, but they thought that His Majesty should be proud of it. How could he leave them out in the cold? The officials of the Board of Rights who accompanied them outside the palace gates gradually became uncomfortable. Ren Shaowen moved closer to Fan Xian and said quietly, "At this time, His Majesty should be meeting with the great prince. As officials, we naturally have to wait a little longer." Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. The carriage of the northern Qi princess had already been led in by the eunuchs of the palace, and the important matters were more or less settled. Fan Xian could guess why the diplomatic mission had been left out in the cold outside the royal palace. The imperial soldiers of the royal palace looked coldly at the anxious and frightened officials outside the palace gates, without a trace of emotion on their faces. And the eunuchs guarding the palace gates naturally did not look directly at them. But Fan Xian's status was different from the others. He was a princess of the palace, and most importantly, she was a highly favored figure. Furthermore, she was a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council. On this diplomatic mission, it was assumed that he would be rewarded in the coming days, so the eunuchs had already brought over a round stool and invited him to rest. Fan Xian was surprised. Is this in accordance with the rules? As he spoke, a head eunuch came over with a fawning expression and helped him sit on the stool. "I say, young Master Fan, I know that His Majesty has always favored you. Besides, you have traveled thousands of miles, so it is only right that you sit on a stool." "Oh, why is Eunuch Ho here?" Fan Xian pretended to be surprised.
The eunuch in front of him was the one he had met the first time he had followed Lady Lu and Ruoruo into the palace.
He knew that the eunuch had a good relationship with Fan Manor, so his face showed affection. And the eunuch had deliberately called him young Master Fan, naturally to put on a show of affection. Fan Xian continued with a smile. "I have just returned from the outside, and I am truly poor. Today there is no reward." Eunuch Ho gave a shrill laugh and lowered his voice. "Who doesn't know that young Master Fan is a master who can turn stone into gold? Furthermore, in the future, you will hold a mountain of gold."
The old servant was about to say a few more flattering words when he heard the palace gates creak open.
A eunuch ran out to deliver the emperor's verbal edict. Fan Xian quickly removed the stool and knelt in front of the palace gates along with the other officials. As he had expected, the emperor gave Fan Xian a good scolding. It was nothing more than relying on his talent, looking down on others, being extremely audacious, and so on. He also said that he was tired today, and told him to report back to the palace the next day. He ordered Count Sinan to discipline him well and punish him severely. At the end of the edict, however, the diplomatic mission was greatly rewarded, and that they would be rewarded in the future. The officials looked at each other. They had not expected that the diplomatic mission would receive such treatment on its first day back in the capital. They could not help but sigh. But some of the more cunning officials looked at Fan Xian with trepidation. His Majesty's verbal scolding had been fierce, but in the end, he had done nothing. He had only ordered Count Sinan to discipline him. It seemed that Sir Fan was indeed favored by the emperor. Fan Xian kowtowed to accept the edict. His expression was somewhat awkward, but his heart was slightly happy. He stood up and patted his bottom. When he turned around, he saw an old acquaintance. It was Gong Dian, the current commander of the palace guards. When Gong Dian saw Fan Xian, a look of admiration appeared on his face. He was about to come up and chat with Fan Xian, but to his surprise, Fan Xian cupped his hands in salute and apologized. He leapt onto his horse, clamped his legs together, and with a wave of his whip, he galloped off into the wide square in front of the palace, leaving behind only a cloud of dust. Gong Dian was stunned. He and his subordinates stared blankly at the light smoke in the distance. Although there was no explicit order against riding horses in front of the palace, Fan Xian was probably the first official to be able to run so nimbly. Fan Xian had already taken care of matters in the council. As for Gao Da and the other 7 tiger guards, they would be taken over by the relevant people. He galloped his horse along the long street, riding against the wind. He didn't know how long he had been running, but he finally entered the south of the city. The sound of hooves rang out on the long street where the stone lion occasionally appeared in front of Fan Manor. It was already night, and the manors of the nobles and ministers on the long street had already been hung up with lanterns. There were only a few pairs, and they were not very eye-catching. Only the front door of Fan Manor was brightly lit. The front door was wide open, and a group of attendants, guards, and guests were standing outside in anticipation. Inside, Lady Lu had also lowered herself to instruct the servant girls and senior servants to heat up tea again and again, waiting for Fan Xian to return. News of the diplomatic mission's arrival in the outskirts of the capital had long spread into the city. They had originally thought that it would take at least 2 days to arrange the formalities before they could enter the capital, but the young mistress in the manor next door coldly said, "He will arrive today." Everyone knew that the present Lady Fan, Lady Lin, was no ordinary person. Since she said that Fan Xian would arrive today, then he would. That was why everyone had waited so long. As for the news of the fight with the great prince, no one in the manor knew. Otherwise, they would have been very worried. "He's coming, he's coming." The sharp-eyed servants had long since seen the horses galloping in the distance. They all rushed down the stone steps and formed 2 groups. Amidst the rustling sounds, Fan Xian rode his horse over and flipped off. He gently kicked Teng Zijing's butt, who was preparing to use it as a horse stool. He laughed and scolded him. "Your broken leg, don't learn from those manor people." "Welcome back, young master," the 2 groups of servants called out in unison. Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. He took 2 steps up the stone steps, took a hot towel from a servant girl, and wiped his face carelessly. Then he took a cup of warm tea and rinsed his mouth. He knew that this was a necessary procedure, and there was nothing to be particular about. But when he returned to the manor and saw the familiar servants and servant girls, he was in a good mood. Even the smile of Lady Lu, who was behind the door, seemed less calculating and more sincere. "Your father is in the study." Lady Lu took the towel from his hand and quietly reminded him. Fan Xian nodded. Suddenly, he furrowed his brows and shook his head. "Auntie." He swallowed the last word, auntie, and smiled. "I'll go see my sister and Warner first." "I'll go see father immediately." Lady Lu knew that the young master in front of her could not be constrained by filial piety, and could only nod helplessly. As soon as Fan Xian entered the manor, he saw a dark-skinned fat man rushing toward him. He couldn't help but turn pale with fright. It had only been a few months since he had last seen this prodigy in the accounting department. But he had no time to ask, and immediately shouted, "I'll report the bill later. I have something to do." Fan Xija paused and scolded, "I'm in a good mood today. If you don't pay attention to me, I won't bother to talk to you about accounts that you don't understand." Fan Xian was also surprised, but he laughed. For some reason, he thought of the row of 4 princes outside the city gate. He took something out of his robes and handed it to Fan Xija.
He laughed and scolded. What account talk?
I think it's a nonsense talk. You go and play by yourself first. We're brothers, so don't play this reunion after a long separation. Fan Xija muttered to himself, I don't want to play this game of brotherhood with you. Thinking this, he watched as Fan Xian entered the back of the manor. He felt very uncomfortable. After Fan Xian got married, he had his own manor in the back of Fan Manor. However, the two residences were connected, so it was only one manor and two residences. He and his sister were very close, and Wanner and Ruoruo were very close, so Ruoruo spent most of her time in this courtyard. And now that he had returned, it was natural that his father would stay in the study. But what was strange was that Wanner and his sister did not come out to greet him. This made Fan Xian quicken his steps.
The serving girl next to him could not keep up, and panted as she replied, The lady is still here, and so is the mistress.
Fan Xian frowned, thinking that this was a very inauspicious thing to say. He didn't know who had trained this serving girl. He came to the door of his bedroom and gently pushed it open, but found that it was locked from the inside. Fan Xian was startled, and didn't know what to say. He called out a few times, but no one answered. He was puzzled, and so he knocked harder on the door.
If it weren't for the respect he had for his wife, he would have broken in already.
After a while, he heard Cici's uneasy voice from inside. Young master, the mistress is asleep. Please don't knock. Fan Xian's frown deepened. He didn't know what had happened.
He had come all the way back, and Wanner had closed the door and refused to see him. He looked at the dim light inside the door and said nothing. With a wave of his sleeve, he went to the other room.
This time he didn't knock, but pushed the door open and entered. The girl in the room was startled, and she stood up.
After seeing that it was Fan Xian, the indifference and wariness between her brows gradually melted, and her eyes flashed with unfeigned joy. She crouched down and said, Brother, you're back.
Fan Xian looked at Ruoruo, and his previous unhappiness disappeared. He smiled warmly. What? Are you not happy to see me back? Fan Ruoruo smiled and walked forward. She pulled on his sleeve and led him to sit down. It's not like we haven't seen each other for a long time. Do you want me to make a big fuss before you're satisfied? Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. You always have such an indifferent personality. You won't change it even in front of me. Fan Ruoruo smiled. If I change it, will I still be Ruoruo? As she spoke, she poured a cup of tea and carefully brought it to her brother's lips. Fan Xian accepted it, but didn't drink it immediately. Instead, he stared at his sister's face, which wasn't very pretty, but was extremely refreshing. For a moment, the room fell into a strange silence. The two siblings were both very patient people, and they waited for the other to speak first. In the end, it was Fan Xian who felt sorry for his sister. He sighed. Why do you have to do this? If there's anything, wait for me to come back and deal with it. A trace of sadness flashed across Fan Ruoruo's face. She knew that her brother had seen through her plans. I was waiting for you to come back and see you, she said softly. That's why it's been delayed until today. Fan Xian stood up and walked directly under her bed. He pulled out a package and took out an unremarkable box from the drawer behind the bed. He flipped the box over on the table. A few banknotes, a few beaded hairpins, and a few pieces of silver fell onto the table with a clatter. He furrowed his brows as he looked at the items on the table. Running away from home with just these few things. It's far from enough. Fan Ruoruo was silent for a moment. She took out a self-defense dagger from her sleeve. Fan Xian was angry, happy, and distressed. He looked at his sister and said, You are a noble young lady. You don't know the dangers of the world. Even if you don't want to marry, don't you think about how worried father will be by running away from home? And what about me? Why don't you think about how I feel? Fan Ruoruo lowered her head. Her hands tightly gripped the corners of her sleeves. After a moment of silence, she said, When did father ever really care about me? As for you, have you forgotten? You taught me to control my own destiny, especially when it comes to marriage. I can't let my family arrange it. Fan Xian was speechless. In this world, no young lady from a noble family would have such a rebellious idea, let alone put it into practice.
His sister was brave and even reckless enough to run away because of the stories he had told her when she was young. He had taught her how to be a good person in his letters. Could it be that Cousin May had told her so much that new Xueqi was ready to awaken? He slapped the table uneasily. He really didn't know what his actions back then would bring to his sister. After all, this world was completely different from that world. Different thoughts could be a dagger that could hurt oneself. He suddenly raised his head and said gently, "But an arranged marriage is not necessarily a bad thing."
You have never been with Hongqing. How do you know if your marriage will be a happy one?
Fan Ruoruo's head was still lowered, but her voice did not soften. You have known the crown prince since you were young.
You know that I don't like him.
If anyone else had heard this, they would have been scared half to death. How could the young lady of Fan Manor say something like whether she liked him or not?
Fan Xian's mind was a mess, but he still tried to explain. Not necessarily. Look at me and your sister-in-law. We were also arranged to be married, and now we live happily.
Fan Ruoruo suddenly raised her head. With a hint of determination and stubbornness, she said, "Brother, not everyone is as lucky as you and your sister-in-law."
Fan Xian was stunned. This was the first time he had seen disapproval on his sister's face. Ever since they were young, Ruoruo had always looked at him with admiration mixed with admiration. This was the first time he had heard Ruoruo directly disagree with his opinion. He couldn't help but be shocked at the changes that had occurred to his sister. After a long silence, the expression on Fan Xian's face gradually softened. In the end, he laughed heartily. There was not a trace of falsehood in the joy in his laughter. He was indeed very pleased that the silly little girl had finally grown up and learned to stick to her own views.
"Ruoruo, do you trust me?"
Fan Xian looked at his sister with a smile and an expression of encouragement. After hesitating for a moment, Fan Ruoruo also showed her usual tranquil smile and nodded heavily. Fan Xian looked at the things on the table. He gently shook his head and smiled. If you trust me, then don't play around with these things. I will take care of it. Ever since she learned that the palace had appointed her to be married, Fan Ruoruo had sunk into silence. She knew how rebellious her thoughts were and what kind of disaster it would bring if she went against the edict. But since she was young, she had been taught by her brother's letters.
Deep in her heart, the seemingly weak but actually strong seed of freedom had long been planted.
But no one had said these thoughts to her. Deep in her heart, she was afraid that even her most trusted brother would oppose her decision. Hearing Fan Xian's promise, Ruoruo's uneasiness for the past month suddenly disappeared like a gentle autumn breeze. Her tense nerves, which had been tense for a month, suddenly relaxed. Yes, her brother was back. Naturally, he would make the decision for her. The brother and sister had been separated for many months. Naturally, they had things to talk about. But Fan Ruoruo saw that his expression seemed a little strange. Only then did she remember that if her brother wasn't talking to her father in the study, then he should be with her sister-in-law. Why would he come to her room? She thought of something and couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh.
"Brother, when you were persuading me earlier, didn't you say that although you and sister-in-law were appointed to be married, you were happy?"
Why are you so worried now? Fan Xian's heart jumped. His sister and Warner had a good relationship.
Naturally, she would know why Warner had shut herself in the room. He quickly asked, "What happened?"
Fan Ruoruo gave a rare mischievous smile. "I can't help you with this. Go ask sister-in-law yourself." Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He was upright and upright. What did he need to ask Warner for? As he was thinking, he heard a servant girl call from outside.
"Young master, the mistress has woken up."
Fan Xian shook his head. He knew his wife was throwing a tantrum.
But Warner had always been a very graceful and pleasant woman.
How could she be like those women in the harem? She knew he had worked hard to get home. If she didn't welcome him, then so be it. Instead, she closed the door on him.
Thinking of this as he walked to his room, a glimmer of anger gradually rose in his heart. But when he reached the door and heard the little Ling coming from inside, his anger immediately dissipated.
On the contrary, a very interesting expression appeared on his face. The voice was clear and sweet. Who else could it be but Lin Warner? And the little Ling was also very familiar. Do you know? Do you know? It should be green and red thin. Fan Xian's expression was slightly embarrassed. The poem he had used to trick Haitang was only known to the Emperor of Northern Qi and the Empress Dowager and himself. How did it get to the capital in the south? Chapter 259. Fan Xian clenched his fist and covered his mouth with a cough. He stepped forward and pushed the door. Naturally, it swung open. He understood what was going on. Since the couple was preparing to have a good fight, there was no reason for them to close the ring and not let anyone in. Even Fan Xian's earlier cough was a reminder to his wife that he was here, and that if there was anything to say, it was best to talk about it in the room. This generation, after all, was a male-dominated society. Although Lin Wanner's background was much more noble than Fan Xian's, since she had married into the Fan manor, it was reasonable to say that she would not express her dissatisfaction so directly. The way the couple interacted with each other was different from that of other official families. Although Fan Xian could not escape the control of the male animal's hormones, on a spiritual level, he still respected women. When all was said and done, this was all Fan Xian's own fault. His sister was preparing to run away from home, and his wife was a little jealous. It was all because of his influence. If this had happened in the manor, it would have long since caused a ruckus. Young master. The servant girl Xueqi covered her mouth and smiled. She welcomed him in, helped him take off his outer shirt, and handed him a towel. Fan Xian waved his hand, indicating that he had already wiped it. He looked at the girl's mischievous smile, and could not help but sigh in his heart. It was not just his sister and Wanner. Even this servant girl had grown up with him, and he had spoiled her to the point where she had no sense of seniority. When the family drama was going on, she still had the leisure to watch the fun, and to tease him for his courage. Lin Wanner was lying on the bed. A thin blanket had been pulled up to her chest, and her black hair was scattered on her shoulders. She looked like she had just woken up. Her large eyes rolled around, and she looked curiously and sweetly at her husband, who had just returned from a long journey. There was not a trace of anger in her eyes, as Fan Xian had prepared to welcome him. Her small nose slightly raised and she said, "My husband, I did not go out to welcome you. Please don't take offense." Fan Xian looked at her peeking porcelain teeth and smiled. He sat down on the side of her bed and began to carry out the three-nose policy. He did not explain, hide, or speak. He put his hand under the blanket, held her slightly cold hand, and squeezed it. They had not seen each other for months, and it had been a long time since he had squeezed Wanner's soft, boneless hand. He did miss it. Xueqi was still in the room, and Lin Wanner could not help but feel embarrassed. She glanced in that direction. Fan Xian raised his head and saw that Xueqi was pretending to tidy up the medicine box on the table, but her eyes were flying in his direction. He couldn't help laughing and scolding. "You little girl, I've really spoiled you. Aren't you afraid of getting a pinprick? Get out." Xueqi chuckled and bowed to the young master and mistress. She then pushed open the door and closed it behind her. Coincidentally, she ran into Xueqi, who had gone to the front of the manor to bring back a tray of food. She quickly blocked her outside. Xueqi was a servant girl who had followed Wanner when she married and had the same status as Xueqi. The two of them got along well. Seeing her blocking the door, she immediately understood what the two masters inside were doing. She couldn't help but make a face. Looking at the tray of food in her hands, she said bitterly, "The young master has just returned home. He has to eat something first." Xueqi smiled and said, "These are just small snacks to fill his stomach. Isn't the manor in front preparing the main meal? Besides, our family's young master needs to eat something first." To Xueqi, these words were unavoidably frivolous, particularly since it involved the young mistress. No matter what, it shouldn't be a joke that servants like her should make. Her expression became ugly. She glared at Xueqi and snorted. Carrying the tray of food, she went to the room next door. Xueqi was slightly stunned. Then she remembered that her previous words were indeed very disrespectful. She stuck out her tongue and hurriedly ran over. After a while, after a moment of silence, there was a burst of extremely low laughter in the room next door. It seemed that the two principal maids had already reconciled. On the enormous bed in the bedroom, under the large blanket, Fan Xian stretched out his right hand and took out the hair fork on his head. At home, he always liked to comb a petal at the back of his head for freshness. He felt his mouth was a little dry. He stretched out his hand to the small table beside the bed and took out a cup of tea to moisten his throat. After thinking for a moment, he brought the teacup to Wanner's lips and fed her half a cup. Wanner's eyes were soft, and her cheeks were slightly flushed. After drinking half a cup of warm tea, She came back to her senses. Embarrassed and angry, she bit his left forearm and said, "How can there be someone as impatient as you? It's just nightfall. If those servants guess, how can I have the face to manage this family?" Fan Xian chuckled and turned to his side to hold his wife. His fingers gently slid along her smooth upper arm. His heart was very satisfied. He said, "Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Besides, we haven't seen each other for a long time. Who would dare to say anything when we're intimate?"
His eyes turned slightly, and he mischievously said, "Besides, if I wasn't so impatient earlier, I'm afraid you would still be suspicious of what I did outside."
Hearing this, Lin Wanner remembered that today she was going to try to persuade her husband. How could she have let him into the room for less than the time it takes to drink a cup of tea? She seemed to have lost her head and almost forgot what she was going to say. Could it be that her husband really did have some sort of bewitching spell? Thinking of this, she couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. She lightly hit him and said, "If you didn't mention it, I would have forgotten. I was going to ask you if you felt anything when you heard that order." Fan Xian licked his somewhat dry lips. His handsome face and this expression didn't seem obscene. Instead, it gave off an indescribable sense of naughtiness.
When it came to the way of a husband and wife, he had always been a man of action.
He didn't care what Wanner was thinking. First, they got into bed and made out. In this world, after intimate matters, women would always be incomparably attached to their lovers, and the jealousy in their hearts would fade a little. But he also knew that there had to be an explanation for this, so he took the initiative to bring it up.
"You little girl, you dare not let me into the room?
Be careful that I don't spank you." Lin Wanner leaned into his arms and quietly said, "If you want to spank me, then spank me. In any case, you only know how to bully me." "What do you mean by that?" Fan Xian laughed. "Are you mad at me for not bringing back chicken wings from Northern Qi?" Lin Wanner got up and half knelt on the bed. Her undergarments were slightly slippery, revealing half of her shoulders. She stared into Fan Xian's eyes, and after a moment of silence, she suddenly said, "I was not happy before." In this world, even if the women were jealous, they would not be as open and aboveboard as Lin Wanner. So Fan Xian was at a loss for what to do. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He could only carefully reply, "What kind of jealousy is this? That song was indeed written by me, but it's not what you think it is." "What do you mean by jealousy?" Lin Wanner didn't understand what he meant. Only then did Fan Xian remember that in this world, there was no story of Lady Feng drinking jealousy and committing suicide. So he laughed and told the story, but he pretended to read it from someone else's notes. After Lin Wanner heard it, she also sighed at Lady Feng Xuanling's strength. But in her heart, she felt that her husband must have made up this story himself. Perhaps he had written it specifically to criticize her. She couldn't help but feel a little angry. "I'm not the kind of petty person who wants to monopolize you. Cece and Xueqi will eventually have to enter the school. You don't have to deliberately use this story to make things difficult for me." Fan Xian knew that his wife had misunderstood him. He laughed and said, "If you don't want to monopolize me, then that's a bit inappropriate." Lin Wanner was, after all, a woman who had grown up in the palace. She didn't understand the hidden meaning of her husband's words. She heard Fan Xian say, "If you weren't jealous, then why didn't you let me enter the school?" Lin Wanner was still half kneeling on the bed. She puffed up her cheeks. After a while, she said, "Do you know that this song has already spread throughout the world? Everyone in the capital knows that Fan Xian, the immortal of poetry, does not compose poetry. This time, on this diplomatic mission to Northern Qi, he made an exception for a woman. It's just a song. If you want to hear it, I will naturally write one for you every day," Fan Xian said with a smile. Lin Wanner faintly said, "Just a song? I hear that in Shangjing of Northern Qi, you and Haitang travel together, drink together, and stroll along the streets in the rain every day. It has already become a legend." Fan Xian felt bitter. He knew that the Emperor of Northern Qi had purposely released this information. But as these words were being passed from mouth to mouth, Lin Wanner was in an awkward position. He was about to explain when his wife asked, "Husband, tell me that girl. Haitang, what does she look like?" Fan Xian was startled. Of course, he couldn't praise Haitang to the heavens. But for some reason, deep in his heart,
He didn't want to invert black and white in front of his wife and belittle Haitang to the point of being worthless, even though this was a shameless thing all men would do in their wives' beds. He thought for a moment and then said, Haitang is the last disciple of the imperial advisor of northern Qi, Xueqi.
She is most favored, and has a high status in the palace.
Since I am on this diplomatic mission to benefit the country, it is only natural that I should befriend such an important person.
Lin Wanner shook her head and sighed. That Haitang girl may not have much of a reputation in the south, but now everyone knows her status in the north. I only have one question, husband. Given Haitang's status, can she be a concubine? Fan Xian was startled, wondering where this wild and unconstrained question had come from. He then heard Lin Wanner sigh and say, a woman like her must have a very high standard. If it weren't for someone of your stature, she wouldn't have taken a liking to you. But with her status, it will be difficult to make arrangements for her in the future. Wanner is angry today because you never think about the consequences of your actions. You are a bit reckless. Fan Xian laughed. I'm not going to marry that Haitang. What consequences? Wanner's words are a bit funny. Lin Wanner turned pale with fright. For some reason, she began to sympathize with the woman called Haitang. She rebuked him. Are you planning to abandon her? Fan Xian waved his hand and held back his laughter. Since there is no chaos, how can I abandon her? A moment later, Lin Wanner looked at him with a trace of suspicion. Really? Then why did you write poems to provoke her? Provoke her? Fan Xian asked the heavens.
After thinking for a while, he told his wife about the arrangements he had made before leaving the capital, as well as the many things that had happened in Shangjing.
He shook his head and said, Haitang's martial cultivation is extremely high. Aside from the 4 grandmasters, I am afraid she is one of the strongest. Since I am going to have dealings with her, of course I have to prepare some sharp weapons. Lin Wanner frowned. Is this what you mean by keep it in your heart? Exactly. Fan Xian smiled. When 2 countries go to war, attacking the heart is the most important. After a long time, Lin Wanner sighed. My husband's plan is a bit shameless.
The disturbance at home had subsided.
Fan Xian thought for a while and then told his wife about his fight with the great prince.
He knew that Wanner had grown up in the palace and had more say in matters of the court than he did.
Ever since they had gotten married, he had gradually gotten used to discussing his plans with her. After hearing what he said, Lin Wanner also frowned. She came to the same conclusion as Yan Bingyun. She felt that there was no need for Fan Xian to offend the great prince. It felt unnecessary. It was impossible for Fan Xian to explain his secret worries to his wife. He could only smile warmly and say, Wanner, don't worry about why I'm doing this.
Just tell me whether or not you think this will make the palace believe that the great prince and I are enemies in the future.
Lin Wanner looked at him with amusement. It will be very difficult. Fan Xian was surprised. Why is that? Lin Wanner sighed. Actually, you have been mistaken about one thing. It is true that the Overwatch Council, in the eyes of the officials and the people, is a sinister and terrifying yamen. The officials of the 6 ministries call you black dogs behind your backs, but not everyone dislikes the Overwatch Council. Just like the military, the Bureau of Military Affairs, and the Western Army. They all have a good impression of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian immediately understood. When it came to war, the most important thing was intelligence and logistics. The Overwatch Council's network of spies all over the world must have provided the military with great support. It could reduce the amount of bloodshed by soldiers. Of course, the military liked the Overwatch Council. He frowned. That is one of the reasons. But the great prince will have to hand over his military power when he returns to the capital. The military's opinion will not affect him much. Lin Wanner did not understand why he wanted the palace to think that he had not befriended the 3 princes. She sighed. There is one more thing that perhaps you have forgotten. Of the 3 princes, the one closest to Wanner is the great prince. Even for my sake, he will not hold a grudge against you. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He knew that when Wanner was young, she spent most of her time in the palace with Lady Ning. It was natural that she would be closest to the great prince. It was just that when he was calculating, he had intentionally or unintentionally neglected this layer of relationship. Perhaps, deep in his heart, he did not want to connect his wife with the princes. Lin Wanner knew what Fan Xian was worried about. She said gently, I think you are worrying too much. The emperor is healthy. The situation you are worried about will probably take many years. Fan Xian sighed and pulled her into his arms. He whispered in her ear, people who do not think about the future will have immediate worries.
Looking at the atmosphere when I return to the capital, I know that when I take over the palace treasury next year, your brothers, the crown prince, the great prince, and the second prince, will not let go of a fat piece of meat like me.
How was the idea I gave you on the Tsang Mountains last year? Lin Wanner did not seem like a 16 or 17-year-old girl. She was more like a female strategist. After all, she was the daughter of the eldest princess. In this area, she had more or less inherited some of this, so Fan Xian had always trusted her advice. But Fan Xian had never agreed to the proposal on the Tsang Mountains.
He lowered his head slightly and said slowly but firmly, asking for power to be reduced is the most appropriate thing to do. For a young official like me to be in charge of the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury, the favor of the emperor is too great, and the power is too great. This is something that should not have happened. But Wanner, I will not let go of the palace treasury.
Although Lin Wanner did not know why her husband did not want to let go of the palace treasury, as a wife, she could only silently support him.
She nodded and said, I understand.
Fan Xian continued, since I am not willing to let go of the palace treasury, then the Overwatch Council is even more so. If the palace treasury was a mountain of gold, then the Overwatch Council was the army guarding it. If the palace treasury was empty, then Fan Xian would be a naked beauty with no sense of security at all. He would be waiting to be wantonly humiliated by the people in the palace.
Lin Wanner sighed and shook her head.
Then you will have to work hard.
She suddenly looked into his eyes and asked, Are you confident?
Fan Xian smiled and gently patted her cheek.
I do not dare to say things with certainty, but you know that I have always been a somewhat arrogant and even narcissistic person.
Lin Wanner smiled. She suddenly bit her thick, plump lower lip and said softly, Actually, I have an idea. Fan Xian's interest was piqued. What idea? Lin Wanner's eyes flashed. No one knew what she was thinking.
She quietly said, Take Haitang as your wife.
Fan Xian turned pale with fright.
He thought to himself that his wife's plan was indeed unexpected.
Lin Wanner excitedly explained, Haitang is an upper 9th level warrior. My husband said that she might one day become a great grandmaster.
Say, if we have a great grandmaster in our family, and she has the power of Xueqi behind her, even the royal brothers of the kingdom of Qing would not dare to do anything to you. Even the emperor would have to try to win you over.
Look at the Yizhong family. All they have is Yi Lu Yun, and they have dominated the bureaucracy for over a decade without suffering a single defeat. Fan Xian knew that what she said made sense. No matter who it was, marrying Haitang would be like having an iron ticket in the house, a gold medal for exemption from death. But he didn't know if his wife was testing him one last time or what, so he laughed evilly and said, But Haitang really doesn't look that good.
Lin Wanner paused for a moment, then spat at him. You pervert.
Fan Xian smiled. He was thinking about what Lin Wanner had said about the Yi family. Yi Zhong was the commander of the capital garrison, and Yi Linger was about to marry the second prince. What was the emperor thinking? A great grandmaster? If the situation really did develop this way, from Fan Xian's point of view, the people in the palace probably did not fear the great grandmaster Yi Lu Yun. He frowned. When I was not in the capital, did Yi Zhong resign from the Jingdo garrison? Lin Wanner shook her head.
Fan Xian sighed in his heart and asked, Did mother send any letters?
The mother he spoke of was naturally the eldest princess of Xinyang. Although he knew that Wanner had no feelings for that peerless beauty, in front of Wanner, he still had to be respectful. Lin Wanner still shook her head. There was no extra expression on her face. Fan Xian felt pity for her. He gently rubbed her forehead. How have you been? He asked quietly. You were so focused on other things that you didn't ask about the most important thing. I deserve a beating. Lin Wanner laughed. Master Fei comes to see me often. I'm also taking the pills. I feel pretty good. Fan Xian nodded. It seems that recuperating in the Tsang Mountains is not bad. This winter, the whole family will live there. It's a shame we didn't soak in the hot springs last year. Their voices gradually lowered. They were whispering sweet nothings and humming a little love song. Unexpectedly, a maid called out anxiously from outside. Young master, young mistress, it's time to eat. Master has sent word to urge us several times. Fan Xian let out a strange cry.
He lifted the covers and immediately began to put on his clothes. He had originally planned to stay in the back of the residence for a while before going to pay his respects to his father. He had not expected that by trading his body for safety, he would sink into a sea of tenderness. He had completely forgotten that his father was still waiting for him in the study. When he thought of his father's solemn face, Fan Xian could imagine how angry he was. A son had traveled 1,000 miles to return home, and yet he had not paid his respects to his parents first. Instead, he had gone to fool around with his wife. Warner complained to him as she began to dress and make up.
Cece and Xueqi had been waiting outside the door for a long time. When they heard the noise, they entered the room to serve the two mistresses. Using the fastest speed they could muster, they followed a servant carrying a lantern. They pretended nothing had happened and went to the front house. In the hall, the servant girls stood quietly to one side. The Minister of Revenue, Count Sinan, sat solemnly in the middle. Although Lady Lu had already helped him to sit, she still stood by his side out of habit, placing cups and chopsticks. Fan Ruoruo sat to his left, deep in thought. Fan Xija sat to the right, his hands hidden under the table as he played with the thing Fan Xian had thrown to him earlier. Seeing Fan Xian and Lin Warner enter, Ruoruo stood up. Fan Xija hurriedly hid the thing in his sleeves and followed his sister in saluting the two. Sitting in the middle, Fan Xian did not look at Fan Xian. Instead, he nodded to Lin Warner. His daughter-in-law's status was somewhat special, and he could not neglect her. There were many rules in a large family, but Fan Xian was busy with official business, so he rarely had time to eat at home. Today was the first time Fan Xian had returned, so naturally he had to be more formal than usual. At the table, not a sound could be heard. With great difficulty, the meal was over. Fan Xian looked at his son and said lightly, "You are going to be made a noble." Chapter 260. First Class Baron. Second Rank. Fan Xian pondered the weight of this title, worried that it would provoke some criticism. In truth, he was being overly cautious. Although the mission to Northern Qi was not a difficult or dangerous affair, it was still a difficult one. At the beginning of spring, His Majesty had disrespected Prime Minister Lin and Assistant Minister Fan, and had kicked him out of the capital. Although Fan Jian had been promoted to minister, giving Fan Xian the title of Baron was, in the eyes of the common people, just a second compensation for the Fan family. No one was too surprised. Furthermore, ever since he had entered the capital, everyone knew that the reason the Emperor of the Palace admired the Fan family's son so much was largely because of his literary talent. Fan Xian was in line with His Majesty's strategy of promoting scholarly governance. This time, Fan Xian had earned a carriage full of books in Northern Qi, and His Majesty would naturally reward him. Although, given Fan Xian's current position, he did not think much of a mere baron. The title of nobility was still based on family and status. It would always have some benefits for doing things. He looked at his father and said, "When will the edict come down?" By this time, father and son had been talking for a long time in the study. Fan Xian chose to talk about some of the less secretive parts of the diplomatic mission. Every time he touched on matters of the council, Minister Fan waved his hand and told him to skip ahead before he could show any signs of awkwardness. When all was said and done, Fan Xian had grown up in Danzhou. After entering the capital, he rarely communicated with his father. Most of the time they talked in this simple and unique study. So, when it came to feelings, it was a bit lacking. But for some reason, he looked at Fan Jian's gray hair growing on his temples and thought of the romantic figures of the Northern Qi kingdom who had already been beaten by the wind and rain. His sadness carried a glimmer of guilt. The director was right. Count Sinan did not owe Fan Xian anything. Fan Xian owed him a great deal. When I enter the palace tomorrow, there will probably be an edict. Minister Fan closed his eyes, drinking the fruit juice that Lady Lu had prepared every night. He seemed to be enjoying it. You did well in the north. Director Chen has asked for much credit, and His Majesty appreciates it. On this trip to Northern Qi, other than his own secret matters, he had not done anything for the court. Even Yan Bingyun's return to Northern Qi was something that happened along the way. It could not be considered a contribution. He could not help but smile bitterly. Actually, on this trip back and forth, I really did not do anything. Sometimes, doing nothing is the best thing to do. Minister Fan slowly opened his eyes. Fan Xian felt a chill in his heart. He thought his father was going to use this opportunity to teach him a lesson about how he had fought with the great prince outside of the capital. Unexpectedly, his father did not say a word about it. Instead, he changed the subject. I've told you many times before not to get too close to the Overwatch Council. I didn't expect you to not listen to me. You were tricked by that old dog Chen Ping Ping. Speaking of this, Minister Fan seemed to be really unhappy. To be able to safely guard the palace treasury is a rare opportunity in the eyes of others. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I wish I could. The problem is, that person in Xinjiang is not willing to let it go so easily. Furthermore, she was the one who started it first. If I did not join the Overwatch Council, how could I contend with someone like that? Minister Fan sighed, thinking that he had indeed not thought through this matter thoroughly. He had not expected the eldest princess to have such a strong reaction. He could only wave his hand and say, after all, she is the emperor's sister, the empress dowager's favorite daughter, and Wanner's birth mother. Let bygones be bygones. Fan Xian believed this. Although he did not believe that his father was a man who would swallow his pride, he knew that his father's loyalty to the royal family was unquestionable. He only sought his own interests for the sake of the family. Furthermore, his father had always insisted that Fan Xian stay away from the Overwatch Council. He did not want Fan Xian to get involved in the capital's complicated and sinister political struggles. But the palace treasury was banknotes, and the bureaucracy was politics. Banknotes and politics had always been twins. It seemed that his father had not understood this law in the beginning. But no matter what, Fan Xian was grateful for Count Sinan's efforts. Father, please do not worry. I will be careful. Fan Xian was satisfied with his attitude. Only the truly strong have the right to show weakness. The weak have always been weak. There is no need to show weakness. Think about it yourself. Fan Xian understood what his father meant. He smiled. Suddenly, he thought of something else. Father, when I return to the capital, can I still have Gao Da and the other 7 follow me? Minister Fan looked at his son, and a gentle smile appeared in his usually solemn eyes. You know that I only train and manage the tiger guards on behalf of the royal family. The real power lies in the palace. If you want to keep those tiger guards, I can only go to the palace and speak for you. But I don't think His Majesty will allow it. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. In his heart, he did not want to part with Gao Da and the other 7 tiger guards. With these silent masters as bodyguards, his safety would be greatly guaranteed. On the meadow outside Wudu, even Hai Tang could not gain the slightest advantage against the 7 tiger guards. Compared to the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, this was a level higher. Not to mention the Qinian unit that he had first established. The Qinian unit was his most loyal force. Although under Wang Qinian's tutelage, whether it was tracking intelligence or other matters, they had slowly taken shape. Unfortunately, they were still a bit weak in terms of martial prowess. But he also understood that the Tiger Guards had always been used as bodyguards for princes. For example, there were a few in the Western Army, and they were responsible for the great prince's safety. Although His Majesty would occasionally transfer the Tiger Guards to the side of certain ministers, those were special missions. For example, when Fan Xian's father-in-law, Prime Minister Lin, resigned and returned to his hometown, His Majesty had sent 4 Tiger Guards to accompany him. This was to commend the Prime Minister for his lifetime of service to the country, and to ensure the Prime Minister's safety on the road. After these specific tasks were completed, the Tiger Guards would return to the capital, disappearing into inconspicuous private residences. Fan Xian knew so much because Fan Jian had always been responsible for handling these matters for His Majesty. Since the diplomatic mission had returned to the capital, if the Tiger Guards continued to follow him and the royal family found out, it would inevitably cause a lot of trouble. Minister Fan looked at the regretful expression on his son's face and couldn't help but smile. Although this child had the style of his mother, and his talent was extraordinary, he was still only a young man. He couldn't help but remind Fan Xian, when you left, that scholar Shi Chanli often came to pay his respects. I met him a few times, and he really is a talented person who doesn't show it. Fan Xian was startled, but then he understood. After his father knew that he had decided not to ask for a reduction in power and leave the Overwatch Council, he began to plan for his future in the bureaucracy. This was to remind him not to forget about his students.
Although Fan Xian's position in the hearts of the world's scholars had been established, and the students his father-in-law had left behind in the court could help him, as time went on, he needed some of his own people to speak in the court.
Understanding his father's thoughts, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel moved. But as a man, he learned not to show his emotions. He only bowed deeply to his father. Minister Fan waved his hand, signaling him to return to his room. Fan Xian thought about it. Regarding his sister's marriage, it was best not to speak too soon. Such arrangements could only be made slowly, and so he respectfully left the room. Watching Fan Xian straight back as he left the study, Minister Fan couldn't help but show some pride and comfort in his eyes. With a son like this, what more could a father ask for? He gently drank the last drop of fruit juice in the bowl. He knew in his heart that this child had long since guessed something. But with this child's temperament, since the other party did not say anything, it naturally did not matter. The future of the Fan clan depended on this child. Thinking of this, Minister Fan couldn't help but admire Prime Minister Lin, who was already far from the center of power in the kingdom of Qing. He thought that old fox's luck was quite good. Minister Fan had paid a heavy price and worked hard for more than 10 years, while Prime Minister Lin had only given birth to a daughter. September was dull and boring. Everything was fine, except for the worry. Fan Xian sat in the carriage, gently knocking on the wooden window lattice, humming a song that no one else could understand to the strange rhythm. Entering the palace was a serious matter for most officials, but he only felt bored. It was the first time he had returned to the capital, and he had made up his mind with his wife and father. He felt that there was nothing to worry about in the entire court, both inside and outside the capital. In a moment, he would enter the palace to receive his title, Kowtow, and then go to the council to sort out his affairs. It seemed that all he could do was return to Tsang Mountain to practice jumping off the cliff. His fingers, which had been knocking on the window lattice, suddenly froze. He suddenly remembered his sister's marriage, and remembered that Li Hongqing was holding a feast on Lujing River to welcome him. His expression suddenly became unsightly. So this dull and boring September was actually such a dog's life. Today was the day of the court. Early in the morning, many officials had arrived at the palace gates to wait. It was said that in the early years, some of the older officials, in order to show their loyalty to the emperor, began to prepare their court attire in the middle of the night. They hurried to the palace gates before dawn, just to wait for the sound of the palace gates opening. After these old officials retired, not being able to hear the creaking of the gates for many nights made them feel particularly uncomfortable. Now that the emperor was on the throne, he hated those who sought fame. So the officials did not dare to come too early, but they also did not dare to come too late. It was unknown who had the idea, but some of the officials actually reserved seats in the tea house at the corner of Xinjiku. As soon as the sun had risen, they left the manor and waited in the private rooms of the tea house. They had their attendants watch the palace gates from afar, so that they could line up at the right time. There was no such thing as a commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Aside from the mysterious figure that had long since been forgotten, Fan Xian was the first commissioner since the founding of the Kingdom of Qing. That was why he was only a fourth-level official in the Imperial College. If it were not for the fact that the emperor had to report to the diplomatic mission, he would not have had the right to attend court. So he did not need to wear court attire for half a day. Early in the morning, he set out from Fan Manor, leisurely all the way. When he arrived at the palace gates, he was much later than most of the other officials. Popularity attracts jealousy, and this was especially true for a young man who had only been in the capital for a year and a half. Furthermore, this young man had torn the faces of most of the officials in the capital, killed a minister, and chased away another. As the saying goes, the turtle responds when the turtle cries, and the fox grieves when the rabbit dies. Everyone looked at this handsome commissioner of the Overwatch Council, yawning as he got out of the carriage. Their eyes were filled with caution and disgust. Fan Xian looked around and felt that the atmosphere was not quite right. These officials were either ministers of various ministries or officials of various temples. They were all second-level officials and above, whose wife did not have a title of nobility, and whose home did not have a few toys bestowed by the emperor. He was so young, and yet he had arrived later than these officials. If he did not have Minister Fan behind him, especially that old cripple, these truly high-ranking officials of the Kingdom of Qing would have cursed him out a long time ago. Naturally, he could not curse them, but the officials would not give him a good look either. They coldly glanced at him and arrogantly turned their heads away. Among the officials, there were a few who had been promoted by Lin Ruofu. They had wanted to go up and talk to Fan Xian and comfort him, but seeing the disdainful gazes of their colleagues, they couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. So they stopped in their steps and only used gentle gazes to greet Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt very uncomfortable being swept by these heated gazes, but he still maintained a calm smile on his face.
Neither servile nor overbearing. He cupped his hands and greeted the officials.
As he cupped his hands, someone behind him coughed. For some reason, Minister Fan had arrived a little late today, and had not come with his son. Fan Xian quickly went up to greet him, and carefully helped his father down from the carriage. Minister Fan looked at him and shook his head.
I am not that old yet.
Fan Xian smiled. He knew that he had gone a little overboard with his acting. Although Minister Fan looked a little unhappy, the officials could see that old Chen Lotzi was unusually happy today.
He did not even let go of his son's hand and led him over.
With Minister Fan personally leading the way, the officials could no longer boast. They all greeted each other. After a short while, Count Sinan had led Fan Xian around the court, allowing him to recognize all the powerful officials in the court. Fan Xian called them uncles, elders, and so on. When the officials looked at the smiling young man again, they found him to be much more pleasing to the eye. The officials who belonged to the Lin faction were even more affectionate, praising Fan Xian for being young and promising, and so on and so forth. But there were still some officials who looked on coldly. Although they bowed, their faces were cold. After all, everyone in the kingdom of Qing knew that Sir Fan Jr. was most famous for his seemingly gentle, but actually sinister smile. The Minister of Appointments, who had been a veteran of 3 dynasties, saw the Fan father and son approach. He could not help but snort coldly. Since the founding of the kingdom of Qing, and even during the reign of the Wei family, it is rare for 2 sons and daughters to attend court at the same time like Count Sinan's. Fan Xian laughed. The Emperor's grace is like the sea. The Emperor's grace is like the sea.
It was as if he could not hear the mockery in the other's words. He gave all the glory to the Emperor.
Fan Xian smiled. He knew that there was no room for him to speak on such an occasion, so he simply kept quiet. At that moment, 3 eunuchs slowly walked out of the palace gates. The one in the middle was clearly of a higher rank. He waved the horsetail whisk in his hand and said softly, "You have worked hard. Please, everyone." The officials immediately stopped exchanging pleasantries. They tidied up their court robes and walked through the palace gates. Perhaps it was because they were used to being here, but they did not even bother to look at the imperial guards at the palace gates and the armed guards at the inner gates. In a moment, they passed the 3 eunuchs, their heads held high and their chests puffed out. They had the air of the masters of the country. It was the first time Fan Xian had attended court, and it was not convenient for him to walk with his father. He could only pathetically drag himself to the back of the line and walk inside with the 3 eunuchs. The eunuch in the lead was Eunuch Ho, whom he was familiar with. But Fan Xian did not dare say anything to him, and it was even more impossible for him to casually hand over a banknote. He could only smile at him in acknowledgement. A long time later, Ho San'er still thought about this question. Why did he think that Sir Fan was a trustworthy supporter from the very beginning? In the end, he concluded that every time Sir Fan looked at him, his smile was very sincere. He was not like the other officials, who would deliberately show him warmth when they needed him. Other times, although he smiled warmly, there was always a hint of disdain in that smile that made people feel uncomfortable. It was Fan Xian's first time attending a court conference, so he couldn't help feeling nervous. However, he stood at the very end of the civil officials and was still far from the dragon chair. If it were not for his tyrannical internal strength and exceptional hearing, he probably wouldn't even have heard what the Emperor said. He knew that the middle-aged man on the dragon chair would certainly notice him, but he still relaxed slightly and began to examine the decorations inside Taiji Palace. Although he had entered the palace a few times, most of his time was spent in the back of the palace, talking with the concubines and touring the mountains with Wanner. This Taiji Palace was the main palace of the royal palace, and he had only seen it from afar. He had never had the opportunity to stand inside. Now that he had entered, he found it to be nothing special. The beams were exquisitely carved with dragons and phoenixes, and the red pillars were imposing. A faint fragrance wafted through the spacious palace, and bronze cranes and strange beasts stood to the side. But compared to the palace of northern Qi, where the sky, water, and color of wealth and beauty merged into one, It paled in comparison. But this palace had a different aura. It seemed to be the smell of power, rising from the dragon throne and making the officials feel awe. It had nothing to do with the dragon throne. The middle-aged man sitting on the dragon throne was the source of this aura. Although his palace was not as grand as northern cheese, and his food was not as exquisite as Dongi's, everyone knew that he was the most powerful man in the world. The main topic of the court meeting naturally could not be separated from the great prince and the diplomatic group. But it was not about the fight for the road outside the city. Even if the imperial censorate wanted to do something about it, they could not bring out a memorial today. It was not that the imperial censorate did not have the ability to rush a memorial overnight, but if they were to rush it, they would probably leave traces and make the emperor unhappy. Today's court meeting discussed the future arrangements of the Western Army, as well as the soldiers' requests for rewards. The great prince had already been made a king, but the 100,000 soldiers under his command had to be accounted for. This point was brought up by the Bureau of Military Affairs, and no one would raise any objections. Although the emperor placed great emphasis on the rule of literature, the kingdom of Qing was, after all, a valiant nation built on military might. No one would make life difficult for the military on this matter. As for the diplomatic group, after reporting on what had happened along the way, the Chamberlain of Dependencies presented the letter of credence on behalf of the Northern Qi delegation, presenting the newly drawn map of the world. Looking at the gradually expanding territory of the kingdom of Qing on the map, the emperor, who had always seemed too calm, finally had a glimmer of passion in his eyes. The officials knew what was good for them, and naturally, they cheered loudly and flattered the emperor. The elders of the Bureau of Military Affairs stroked their beards proudly. This was the land that the sons of the army had fought for with their own blood and flesh at this time. Not many officials realized that in the process of negotiations, the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies, including Xueqi and Chiwu, Fan Xian, and the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had played a large role. Even if they realized it, they would purposely ignore it. Fan Xian looked at the joy in the hearts of the officials in court. Involuntarily, a slight smile rose to the corners of his lips. After all, he had once participated in this major event. He thought that if the eldest princess had not sold Yan Bingyun out, the kingdom of Qing would probably have gained even more. But the eldest princess had turned around and tossed Xiaowen back to Northern Qi, causing the Northern Qi court to gradually develop signs of internal strife. The ruler and officials were at odds with each other, and this was a very powerful move. Comparing the two, the only difference was short-term benefits versus long-term benefits. The most powerful middle-aged man in the world, after a burst of uncontrollable faint joy in his heart, immediately regained his calmness with great self-control. Supporting his chin with his hand, he wore a smile on his face as he listened to the praises of his subjects. His gaze, however, swept across the back of the ranks of his subjects indifferently. After seeing the smile on that little fellow's face, his mood somehow became a little better. He waved his hand, and the eunuch holding the brush and the head of the secretariat began to recite the already drafted edict in a sharp voice. Because there were too many soldiers to be rewarded, and the opinions of the great prince and the elders of the military had to be consulted, it had to be delayed for some time. This edict was mainly for the members of the diplomatic mission. The hall fell silent. Everyone knew that after the diplomatic mission, it was just a routine reward, and the officials did not care. They only pricked up their ears to hear Fan Xian's name from the eunuch's sharp voice. Baron of the first rank, second rank. The officials all breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that His Majesty still had a sense of propriety. Regardless of their relationship with the Fan family, these officials did not want Fan Xian to be given such a high title at such a young age. Everyone thought in different directions and stood in different positions, but their thoughts were very similar. Xueqi Chiwu, Fan Xian, and the others had long since knelt in the hall and thanked the emperor for his grace. Just as the officials were about to hear the words, "If there is something to report, if there is nothing to report, the court is dismissed," His Majesty sat on the dragon chair and said lightly, "The few of you stay." His Majesty's gaze fell on the few high-ranking officials closest to the dragon chair. After Lin Ruofu resigned as Prime Minister, the court could not find a suitable candidate to replace him, so the current affairs of the cabinet were handled by a few scholars and ministers. These days, after court meetings, His Majesty would often ask them to stay and say a few more words. Today, the Crown Prince and the Great Prince were also in the hall, so they naturally had to stay and say a few words. So the officials did not feel that anything was amiss. After greeting the emperor, they all retreated from the hall. Then, These officials heard something that made them feel incomparably jealous and envious. Fan Xian, you stay as well. Chapter 261. With strange expressions on their faces, the officials walked past Fan Xian and exited Taiji Palace. At this moment, Fan Xian felt a little uneasy. He knew what the situation of the conversation in front of the emperor would be. Even if he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he would probably stand out. In the end, his experience and age were too young. But since things had come to this, he could only accept it calmly.
With a trace of caution, he followed behind the old officials and followed the eunuch to the back of the palace.
After a few turns and 2 turns, they didn't walk very far. They came to a side hall. The ceiling was blocked, so the space didn't seem very spacious. To the left was a large row of wooden shelves that were as tall as a person. The shelves were all filled with books. Fan Xian secretly looked around at the decorations. He knew that this was probably the legendary royal study. A smile appeared at the corner of his lips. He was probably thinking of the braid plays he had often seen in his previous life.
At this time, the emperor had already taken off his dragon robe with the help of the eunuchs.
He had changed into a sky blue casual shirt with a jade belt tied around his waist. He looked quite casual.
The emperor reclined on the low couch and reached out to place a teacup on the table. He casually waved his hand, and the eunuchs hurriedly brought 7 round chairs with embroidered surfaces into the room.
The 7 old officials bowed to express their thanks and naturally took their seats.
The crown prince and the great prince stood next to the low couch that the emperor was sitting on. Although there were no seats, one could tell from the expressions on their faces that this had always been the rule. However, there had always been 7 chairs in advance. Today, there was an additional young official. The eunuchs of the royal study had probably never seen Fan Xian before, so they were in a bit of a dilemma. They didn't know if he was just a low-ranking official who had been sent in for questioning or some other noble figure. Everyone was sitting, and Fan Xian was standing alone. This immediately made him stand out. His father, Minister Fan, was looking at his nose and did not even glance at him. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly. He moved his already inconspicuous position further back. His small action was noticed by the crown prince. The crown prince smiled slightly at him. Fan Xian only dared to return the gesture with his gaze. Inadvertently, he saw the great prince give a small yawn behind the emperor. He had probably just returned to the capital yesterday and had drunk a lot of wine. He was probably very tired today. Other than the day when they first met in the tea house by the Lujing River, today was the closest Fan Xian had ever been to the emperor. He was so close that he could almost touch the emperor. He couldn't help but raise his head slightly and quickly sweep his eyes over the emperor, but he didn't dare to stare at him. After all, the other party was the emperor. Although there was an official called Mu Tianyan in the Qing dynasty, no one dared to wantonly appreciate him as if he was a beauty. But it was this quick glance that allowed Fan Xian to clearly see the other's face. He was almost stunned by the look in her eyes. The emperor glanced at him and did not mind his direct stare. Fan Xian's expression showed that he was lucky, but there was no fear in his heart. After a while, the second prince, who was studying with the little prince in Xingqing Palace, was also invited over by a eunuch. When he entered the royal study, he was still holding the little prince's hand. Seeing the harmonious scene between the 2 brothers, the emperor nodded slightly, seemingly satisfied. The crown prince had a smile on his face, but who knew how many profanities he was cursing in his heart. Bring Fan Xian a seat. After the 4 princes all stood next to the low couch, the emperor seemed to notice that Fan Xian was still standing, and casually ordered him. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. I wouldn't dare. Given his rank, entering the royal study was already an exception. These 4 princes were still standing, so how could he dare to sit? When the 6 old officials heard the emperor give this young man a seat, they also felt an itch under their buttocks. They moved, twisted, and coughed. It was clear that they were somewhat dissatisfied. They had been in the court for at least 20 years before they finally had a seat in front of the emperor. Fan Xian, this child of the Fan family, had just entered the royal study and already had a seat. The crown prince looked at the officials and respectfully said to the emperor, Father, Fan Xian is young, and his body is not as strong as the old officials. Look at how frightened he is. It is better for him to stand. These words were spoken very calmly, and whether it was the old officials or Fan Xian, they all felt grateful. At this time the great prince spoke again and said, I remember back then when you had us listen to the officials discuss the state. We had to stand because we were going to assist the crown prince in ruling the country and bringing peace to the world.
Since it was a lesson, then the students had to act like students. He did not finish, but the meaning was already clear. Fan Xian was young and had just entered officialdom. What achievements did he have? What ability did he have for us princes to treat him like a teacher? The old officials also stroked their beards and shook their heads. This seat looked normal, but the meaning hidden within it was no small matter. They dared to guarantee that if Fan Xian actually had a seat in the royal study, the news would spread throughout Jingdo in less than 3/4 of an hour. Fan Xian was preparing to go with the flow and thank the emperor. Unexpectedly, he saw the indifferent gaze the emperor cast his way. His heart trembled slightly, and he swallowed his words. The emperor glanced at the officials and then at his eldest son, who, although straightforward, had a slightly impatient temperament. He said, naturally, Fan Xian does not deserve this seat. But today he must sit.
It is not to reward him, but to reward him for his service. No one understood what he meant, but since the emperor had spoken, the royal study was naturally silent. The emperor gazed at his sons and said in a gentle voice, if you can also bring back a carriage full of books from Zhuang Mohan's family, I will let you sit as well.
Everyone was silent. They all knew what this carriage represented.
Although they still felt that the emperor was a bit prejudiced when it came to scholarly fame, they did not know how to argue. The emperor knew what everyone was thinking and said coldly, don't think that this is only a matter of scholars.
What is a scholar? You officials are all scholars. I don't lack martial arts. What I lack is the art of governing the country. It's easy to unify the world, but it's difficult to unify the people's hearts.
If I don't work hard on this, I won't be able to do it just by relying on swift swords and swift horses.
The great prince's face clearly showed his disapproval, but his father had not finished speaking, so he did not dare to say anything.
He listened as the emperor continued unhurriedly. You can immediately take over the world, but you cannot immediately rule it.
The art of literature seems illusory, but it involves the hearts of all the scholars under heaven. Back in the day, I went on 3 northern expeditions, beating the Wei family into a mess. Who would have thought that the Zhan family would take advantage of the chaos to rise?
In just a few years they gathered a large group of talents, and that is how the court of Northern Qi today came to be.
They have stopped our horses from marching north. What do they rely on?
They rely on their rightful position in the hearts of all the scholars under heaven.
The world is in the right mood?
Wasn't this the work of scholars?
Xu Wu, Yan Hang Shu. You are officials of the kingdom of Qing, but you took the imperial examinations in Northern Wei. Why is that? Xu the scholar and Minister Yan hurriedly stood up, fearful and uneasy.
The emperor waved his hand and said, all the scholars under heaven are like this.
I do not blame you, and you do not need to doubt yourselves. I just want to tell you that the world is in the right mood, and the loyalty of the scholars will bring many benefits. Each county will have more talented and virtuous officials, and you will also have an advantage in speech. He looked at his eldest son and said coldly, I know what you are thinking, but if when you send out your troops, there will be less resistance and fewer soldiers under your rule will die, do you not want that? The great prince was silent.
The emperor then said coldly, a carriage of old books can help me attract more scholars to travel the world, and can help me save the lives of countless soldiers.
Why can't I give Fan Xian this seat? Everyone felt that it was a bit strange.
It seemed that the emperor was deliberately showing his favor to the world. And why did Minister Fan not come out to take the seat on his son's behalf?
But the entire kingdom of Qing was born in the flames of war, and its people had an overwhelming fanaticism and a sense of mission to unify the world. Since the emperor had linked the books that Fan Xian brought back from this diplomatic mission to the general trend of unifying the world, who dared to say anything more? They all stood up and praised the emperor's wisdom. What direct relationship could a carriage have with the world? Fan Xian thanked the emperor for the seat. His face was calm, and he sat as steady as a mountain.
He laughed bitterly in his heart, not understanding why the emperor wanted to put him on top of a fire cage to roast.
The red velvet cloth was pulled back, revealing a large map inside. The map had been rearranged. The yellow territory of the kingdom of Qing was continuously extending toward the northeast, and other than the wasteland behind her, everything else was hers. The kingdom of Qing's territory was expanding rapidly. Although northern Qi still looked like a giant, In front of the wild beast that was the kingdom of Qing, it was bloated. Although northern Qi was also a new country, it had not only inherited the vast territory of the Wei Kingdom, but it had also inherited the Wei Kingdom's already rotten bureaucracy and customs. Fan Xian looked at the map and listened to the incessant sounds of discussion. Standing in the heart of the kingdom of Qing, it was the first time he felt the kingdom of Qing's valiant style of doing things and wild ambitions. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The court in the north still had power. Looking at the thoughts of Haitang and the emperor, once the world was in chaos, the people of the world would inevitably suffer, and he didn't know how long it would take to recover. Although he was not a pacifist who bemoaned the state of the universe and pitied the fate of mankind, he had no interest in such things as war. At this moment, the emperor was discussing important matters of state with a few officials. Occasionally, he would hear a few words about the defense of the river embankments, as well as the annual income and the tributes of the small vassal states. Fan Xian knew nothing of these matters, and naturally, he would not interrupt. Even if he had thoughts, sitting on the tiger stool, he would not say a word. Unintentionally or unintentionally, everyone had forgotten about him in a corner of the imperial study. That was why he had the leisure to look at the obviously improved map and stare blankly at it, sighing like a disciple of the Mahist family. Suddenly, a word jumped into his ears: the palace treasury. He frowned slightly, and his heart gradually grew wary. The emperor had asked him to stay, and it was not as simple as giving him a stool and giving him face. As you all know, although the palace treasury is called the palace treasury, it is connected to many vital points, the emperor said hatefully. These years, the palace treasury has been in an embarrassing situation. In the third year of the new calendar, when the rivers in the south were dredged, and the north was cold, I ordered the palace treasury to transfer silver to the national treasury. Who knew? The Guanghui treasury could not even produce silver. The Guanghui treasury was one of the 10 treasuries of the palace treasury that specialized in storing banknotes, but the gold and silver should be stored in the undertaking treasury. The emperor's anger seemed to have been directed at the wrong person. But no matter what, the undertaking treasury and the Guanghui treasury were jointly managed by the eldest princess and the Ministry of Revenue. Although the Ministry of Revenue did not dare say a word in these 10 years, the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, quickly stood up and apologized. The emperor waved his hand and did not even look him in the eye. He continued, "The new policy has come to an end, but I have decided to make an issue of the palace treasury. I do not seek to restore the prosperity of 10 years ago, but at least every year, I want to earn some silver for the court." His voice was not loud, and his tone was not very intense, but the power contained within made everyone afraid to speak. "My royal sister has returned to Xinjiang, and there needs to be a high-ranking official to handle this matter. What good candidates do you have in mind? Report them to me." The officials and princes in the royal study all knew that this was just a formality. The capital had long known that the emperor's preferred candidate was Fan Xian, who was sitting quietly in the back. And the emperor had borrowed a vehicle to show off, and vigorously supported Fan Xian to the throne. It was nothing more than a way to show his stance to the officials, so that they would not sing a different tune when it came to choosing the person in charge of the palace treasury. But everyone knew that the situation of the palace treasury was not as bad as the emperor had made it out to be. Every year, the goods that were shipped from Jiangnan to the north earned at least a few million liang of silver for the court. If it were not for the secret business of the palace treasury, the kingdom of Qing would not have the financial resources to expand everywhere. For a moment, a faint jealousy of the Fan family grew. But since the emperor appeared to be so dissatisfied, no matter who took over the palace treasury in the future, they would probably have a headache over the amount of money to hand over every year. Thinking of this, the officials' jealousy and hatred faded a little. But even so, no one was willing to suggest Fan Xian at this time. This was a matter of face, and also a matter of money. No matter how difficult it was to manage the palace treasury, the person in charge would still reap a lot of profit every year. These officials also received generous rewards from Xinjiang every year. So how could they not know? The officials did not say anything, and Fan Jian, due to his status, could not recommend his own son. For a moment, the royal study fell into an awkward silence. The emperor did not say anything. He only picked up his teacup and took a small sip. His expression was normal, but no one noticed the coldness in his eyes. I recommend. Everyone in the royal study was shocked. The silence had been broken by two people at the same time, and the two people who spoke at the same time were the crown prince and the second prince. This situation was fascinating.
The emperor nodded slightly and said, "Speak."
The second prince glanced at the crown prince and smiled slightly apologetically. Since the crown prince has a good candidate, I am all ears.
The emperor glanced at him and did not say anything. The crown prince saw that the second prince was being modest. As the master of the Eastern Palace and the future emperor of Qing, he naturally would not pass on this responsibility. He bowed to his father and said, "Father, I recommend Fan Xian." Everyone in the royal study knew that the Eastern Palace had spared no effort in pulling Fan Xian in. Furthermore, this kind of favor was something they could do at little cost. Unexpectedly, the emperor did not immediately express his stance. Instead, he asked the second prince, "Who are you going to recommend?" The second prince smiled shyly and said, "I am also going to recommend Fan Xian, Sir Fan." The royal study was still quiet, but the emperor swept a meaningful glance over Fan Xian. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He prepared to rise and respond. Unexpectedly, the emperor did not give him the opportunity. He lightly said, "Since you two brothers think Fan Xian can do it, then it is him. After autumn, we will draft an edict. There is no need to send it to the various provinces." With this, the topic was settled. Although this was something that had been decided in the palace when Fan Xian and Lin Wanner married last year, it had been brought up in the royal study and recorded. Naturally, it could not be changed. Thinking of the Fan family's father controlling the national treasury and son controlling the palace treasury, everyone felt a strange feeling in their hearts. This kind of royal favor, this kind of honor, there was no other family in the capital. Looking at the crown prince and the second prince fighting to hand over to Fan Xian, they knew that the status of the Fan family in the years to come would probably only rise and not fall. It was like adding oil to a raging fire. Fan Jian and Fan Xian, father and son, quickly rose to give their thanks and repeatedly expressed their fear. The emperor did not pay them much attention. Instead, he smiled and asked, "Since it has been decided, then I have come to ask you too. Why do you both favor Fan Xian?" The crown prince thought for a moment and then smiled. "I only have a rough idea. Minister Fan has managed the finances of the country and has been very effective. Since Fan Xian is his son, I think he should have some talent in this area." The second prince also smiled and said, "I also think so. Besides, the palace treasury involves many gold, silver, and silver objects. It needs a clean and honest official to manage it. I will say something rashly. Nowadays, in the officialdom, corruption is the norm. Although there are famous clean and honest officials in each province, most of them are in the local areas. Sir Fan Jr. is brimming with talent. Everyone knows he is a man of literature and nobility. I think it is appropriate for him to manage the palace treasury." The emperor's expression did not change. He asked, "That makes sense. Is there any other reason?" The crown prince and the second prince looked at each other, feeling a little confused. Could it be that the emperor was using this opportunity to test them? The arrow was knocked on the bowstring, and it had to be fired. The crown prince could only brace himself and say, "Second brother is right." Furthermore, the supervision of the palace treasury has always been the responsibility of the Overwatch Council. Since Sir Fan is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, I think it will be much more convenient for the two departments to work together. The little prince, who had come in with the second prince, had been standing for a long time. His feet were a little sore. Perhaps he did not understand what the white-bearded officials were saying to his father, so he could not help but feel a little tired. In his daze, he felt a little strange. He laughed and said in a childish voice, "Brother Crown Prince, according to what you say, Fan Xian is supervising himself?" He was a child, so he could speak a little more freely. Others would only think that he was speaking childishly. But it seemed like he was speaking carelessly, but it pointed out the Crown Prince's mistake. Although the officials did not dare to speak, the Crown Prince's face was slightly sullen. Fortunately, the second prince was also distressed. "Father, I really cannot think of anything." The emperor did not rebuke the Crown Prince. He only said lightly, "You cannot think of anything? Then why did you want to protect him earlier?" The people in the royal study saw the emperor's hesitation. He clearly had his heart set on Fan Xian, but he still wanted to make trouble for his two sons. They felt that the emperor's heart was hard to predict, so they could only keep their mouths shut for fear of causing trouble. As the person involved,
Fan Xian felt that the tiger stool under his buttocks was not only pricking, but also burning his buttocks. At this moment, the second prince spoke with a trace of unease. Actually, there is another reason. Because I have a good personal relationship with Sir Fan. The emperor looked at his second son calmly. After a moment, he suddenly laughed. His laughter seemed very comfortable. There are thousands of reasons, but this one is enough. What is this palace treasury? It is the treasury of the royal family. Since Fan Xian is in charge of the palace treasury, he naturally needs to be close enough to the royal family. Since Fan Xian has worked at Taichung Temple, this closeness is enough. Of course it was enough. No matter what, Fan Xian was a princess consort. No matter what, the crown prince and the second prince often called him brother-in-law. The crown prince listened to this and couldn't help but sigh. He thought that the second prince was indeed amazing. He had actually guessed the answer that the emperor wanted. Why was he a bit slower? Because the army had just returned and the borders had just been settled, today's meeting was a bit longer than usual. It was actually past lunchtime. The emperor looked at the time and ordered the eunuchs to prepare food. He had the officials and princes stay behind to eat together. This was the first time Fan Xian had eaten something made by the royal kitchen. He didn't think there was anything special about it. It was just some vegetables, fish, and chicken. What made him feel even more comfortable was that eating with the emperor was not as uncomfortable as he had imagined. He didn't have to kowtow again before eating. The crown prince's and the second prince's earlier words all fell into his ears. He knew he couldn't hide. When he looked again at the middle-aged man on the dragon couch, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of wariness and coldness in his heart. The emperor's favor was based on some absurd fact, but he didn't think that an emperor would have such a rare thing as family. Fan Xian was not a person who was easy to control. He could kneel, endure, and listen. However, when something threatened his bottom line, he would smile and touch his left calf. He could not kneel, endure, or listen. He would only say, "Fuck you." The crown prince and the princes obediently waited on the emperor as he ate. They then went to eat in the side palace. The emperor was chatting with a few old officials. Naturally, they didn't talk about national affairs at the table. Instead, they talked about whose well water was the best to make tea, which province's watermelons were as big as boulders, and so on. Occasionally, they would mention the world's gossip. Naturally, they couldn't help but mention the death of Zhuang Mohan. Everyone's voices seemed to grow dim. Other than Xu the scholar and Yan Hangshu, these high-ranking officials of the Qing kingdom and even the emperor had memorized Master Zhuang's strategies during their initiation. In short, this meal was much more relaxing than the family banquets at Fan Manor. Fan Xian was a bit hungry and didn't listen to the conversation. He picked up a long soup bean sprout with his chopsticks and brought it to his mouth. Suddenly he heard the emperor point at him and say, "Fan Xian, come here." Fan Xian put down his chopsticks and reluctantly glanced at the fragrant bean sprouts in soup. A bright smile appeared on his face, and he quickly walked to the side of the emperor's low couch. Looking at the thin but heroic face, his eyes showed just the right amount of excitement and sadness, and he cupped his hands in salute. The old officials didn't know why the emperor had called him over, and they listened with curiosity. The emperor smiled and looked at him. "Do you still remember that day in the tea house by the Lujing River? What did I promise you?" Fan Xian hadn't expected that the emperor would talk about the coincidental encounter in front of these high officials. He smiled and said, "I didn't know it was you that day, Your Majesty, and I even exchanged a blow with Commander Gong. I offended Your Majesty, and I deserve to die." The Minister of Appointments, relying on his reputation as a senior statesman of 3 dynasties, stroked his beard and said, "So Your Majesty and Master Fan met outside the palace." When the Emperor of the Kingdom of Qing was discussing matters of state, he didn't seem angry, but now he seemed very easygoing. He chuckled and told the officials what had happened that day. Fan Jian thought to himself that this was absurd, and had no choice but to ask His Majesty to forgive his son for his offense. The other elders of the court were muttering to themselves that it was no wonder Fan Xian was so deeply favored by His Majesty. It turned out that he had such a fortuitous encounter, and that his luck was a little too good. They couldn't help but wonder what His Majesty had promised Fan Xian. "I once said that I would make a good marriage for your sister." The emperor looked at Fan Xian with a very gentle gaze, with a hint of pride that an emperor shouldn't have. Now that Miss Fan has been promised to Crown Prince Jing, What do you think of this marriage? Fan Xian's heart was filled with bitterness, but his face was full of gratitude. He thanked his father again and again. The old officials next to him, after a moment of surprise, also began to flatter him.
They said that the emperor had met an official by the riverside, and that a marriage had been fated.
It was a story that would be passed down through the ages. His voice was a bit loud, and it reached the ears of the princes who were eating in the next room. The great prince frowned, but the crown prince smiled, feeling even more confident that his decision to win over the Fan family was a wise one. He looked at his second brother's face, and found that his expression hadn't changed.
He was still as calm and unhurried as he had been all these years.
He even seemed a bit strange, as he chewed his food slowly and continuously.
He couldn't help but curse his hypocrisy in his heart. Inside and outside the palace where the royal study was, there was laughter and the sound of praising the emperor.
Who knew the troubles and pain in Fan Xian's heart? When Fan Xian stepped out of the palace in the afterglow of the sun, he saw the crown prince on horseback at the entrance of the new street. His troubles grew. Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, came to greet him with a face full of joy. His face showed the joy of meeting again after a long time, and there was no real emotion in his heart. The sun was setting in the west, and night was coming. Chapter 262. In a corner of the square outside the palace, on a street that connected to Xinjiku, one could vaguely see a bashful crescent moon hanging in the sky. In the dusk, Li Hongqing dismounted from his horse and casually cupped his hands in greeting. He looked at his friend, who was as pretty as a woman, and couldn't help but smile. I see that your face is glowing with a red light. It's indescribably colorful. I think you must have gained a lot today. Fan Xian laughed. We haven't seen each other in months, and the first thing you say is to make fun of me. You are the crown prince of King Jing, the fifth most powerful young master in the capital. Why make life difficult for a poor person like me? Other than the four princes, among the younger generation, Li Hongqing's status was naturally the most respected. Fan Xian had purposely placed him as the fifth young master. If it had been a normal friendship, it would inevitably have seemed frivolous. But between the two of them, it seemed very intimate. Li Hongqing was a little surprised. This guy had always been too lazy to provoke me in the capital. His gentle smile always carried a trace of deeply hidden loneliness. Why had his personality changed today? Thinking of something, he thought he understood, and laughed. You also have a poor life? His Majesty dotes on you so much that after the court discussion, he deliberately kept you here. I'm afraid that the officials in the capital would grit their teeth and bear such a hard life. Fan Xian waved his hand and said nothing. Tang Zijing, who had been waiting outside the palace, had long since come to greet them. But seeing that the crown prince was talking to the young master, he didn't dare interrupt.
Young master, he hurriedly said, the old master told me to follow you.
Li Hongqing laughed. What? Master Fan, are you worried that I will get Fan Xian drunk? Then follow me, Fan Xian said from the side. As they spoke, Fan Xian's carriage drove over. Li Hongqing was just letting the prince's attendant bring the horse over. He turned his head and asked curiously, What? Do you still only want to ride in a carriage and not on a horse? I'm not in a hurry, said Fan Xian. Why would I ride a horse? Li Hongqing couldn't help but shake his head and sigh.
If it weren't for the fact that the people of the capital know that you are skilled in both literature and martial arts, I'm afraid they would look down on you and think you are just a useless scholar without the strength to truss a chicken.
The Qing kingdom revered martial arts. Young people were proud of being good at riding, but Fan Xian did the opposite. When there was a carriage, he refused to ride a horse. This strange habit had long spread throughout Jingdo this year. Fan Xian laughed and scolded him. He walked towards the carriage and said, Riding a horse hurts my butt. The guards of King Jing's manor had already surrounded them. Together with the guards and servants of Fan Manor, they formed a small group of a dozen or so people. They surrounded a large horse and an unremarkable black carriage, slowly heading east of the city. There was no curfew in Jingdo. Although it was already dusk, there were still many people on the streets. Seeing this eye-catching group, seeing the handsome young man on the horse, and seeing the square insignia on the carriage, they knew who the two people were. The people of Jingdo all knew of the diplomatic mission's return. Since they were traveling with Crown Prince Jing,
They assumed that the person in the carriage was the legendary illegitimate child of the Fan family, Sir Fan Jr. They couldn't help but stop and watch. Some of the bolder students even called out to the carriage, "Immortal fan of poetry, immortal fan of poetry." Last year's banquet in front of the palace hall had been talked about by the people of Jingdo for a long time. And this time, Zhuang Mohan's gift of a book in Northern Qi, with the intentional help of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had become a well-known anecdote. Fan Xian's reputation had taken another step forward. Later, the poem, "Do You Know?" Later, when the poem Immortal of Poetry began to spread, the people learned that Sir Fan Jr. had dared to flirt with Grandmaster Ku He's female disciple in Shangjing, Northern Qi, in front of countless young nobles of Northern Qi. Every time the people of Jingdo thought of this, they felt their hearts grow hotter. It was as if this matter was even more glorious than Zhuang Mohan's gift of a book. The begonia that you worship like a saint, in the hands of Sir Fan Jr., is no more than a flower bud waiting to be plucked. Fan Xian had brought face to the people of Jingdo, and naturally the people of Jingdo had to bring face to Sir Fan Jr. Along the way, people constantly greeted Fan Xian on the street. Most of them were scholars. Occasionally, there would be a girl with a shy expression bowing to him. Sir Fan Jr. had won the hearts of the people of Jingdo. Naturally, the people of Jingdo had overlooked Crown Prince Jing, even though he was the most arrogant person in the capital. However, Crown Prince Jing's face did not show any displeasure. On the contrary, he smiled happily. It seemed that the respect Fan Xian received was also his honor. Listening to the chatter and greetings outside the carriage, it was reasonable to say that Fan Xian, at this moment, would not open the window and wave his hand in greeting like the chief of his previous life. At the very least, there should be a satisfied smile on his face. But who would have thought that inside the carriage, there was only a helpless bitter smile on his lips. The place the Crown Prince had arranged for Fan Xian to receive him was still Yishe Tavern. It was the restaurant where Fan Xian had spoken of his strength of character when he had first arrived in the capital. This restaurant could be considered a luxurious place in Jingdo, but it was not quiet enough. It was far from the best restaurant. Fan Xian couldn't help but not understand why Hongqing would choose such a place, but he didn't have any objections. When he got off the carriage, he realized that Yishe Tavern was unexpectedly quiet. There were not many people on the long street in front of the building, and the usually bustling building was even quieter. Fortunately, the building was brightly lit. Otherwise, he would have wondered if, in the months that he had been away, this second-to-none golden restaurant might have closed because of business failure. Seeing the doubt in the corner of Fan Xian's eyes, Li Hongqing did not deliberately mystify him. He smiled and said, "I'll take care of everything today." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "Although you are a great crown prince, this is too much of a scene. Who knows how many high officials and nobles come and go to Yishe Tavern every day? For the sake of inviting me to dinner, you have caused others to suffer. I'm afraid they will be jealous. If you want peace and quiet, there are many places in the west of the city. Even if you like the taste here, you can reserve a whole floor. To have an entire restaurant waiting for the two of us is too ostentatious. Even if King Jing doesn't scold you, it won't be good if word gets out to the palace." Li Hongqing saw the sincerity in Fan Xian's words, and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. He felt touched and smiled. "What are you afraid of?" "I'm afraid everyone in the world knows that my father loves to grow flowers, and I love to pluck them. I've always been impulsive. I can't get rid of the title of a licentious crown prince. What does it matter?" Fan Xian knew that, given his status, he could afford to put on such airs. He smiled and shook his head. "You're about to get married, and you don't know how to restrain yourself." Hearing him talk about marriage, Li Hongqing's face showed a faint joy, but he was a bit embarrassed to talk about it. "Don't be too careful," he said. "You have a lot of power in your hands, and you've married a good wife. Let me be frank with you. In the palace and the manor, we of the younger generation have to know our limits. But once we leave the palace and the manor, we are the real masters. Let other people talk." These words were impulsive, exaggerated, and arrogant, but coming from Li Hongqing's mouth, they didn't provoke disgust. Fan Xian had been suppressing a bellyful of boredom in the palace, so he just smiled and followed Li Hongqing into the building. When they reached the bottom of the building, they saw the words Yishe Tavern, written by Sir Pan Ling himself. Li Hongqing stopped and pointed. "Do you remember where we first met?" he asked. Fan Xian smiled. "It's here." Yes, in just a short span of a year the person who made such harsh remarks and repeatedly said that you looked down on so-called gifted scholars, has now become the most famous great scholar in the world. Li Hongqing couldn't help but shake his head and laugh. If you could think of the great Zhuang Mohan passing on his legacy to you, would you still be in the mood to scold those scholars? Fan Xian thought of the events of the past year, and he couldn't help but feel a little sentimental. He sighed. I don't care if you laugh at me, but at the time, I was just an illegitimate child who had just arrived in the capital. I had never seen anything, so I couldn't help but have a few baskets of complaints. Li Hongqing looked at him with a smile. He knew that the reason why this young friend of his had changed so much in a year was because of the emperor's favor, Minister Fan's secret protection, and a marriage alliance. But for him to become the commissioner of the Overwatch Council at such a young age, and to have a seat in the royal study, it would have been impossible without some real talent. Furthermore, the Bangxian's high poetry anthology had appeared several times, and that was proof for all to see. As for the duties of the Overwatch Council, the nobles in the capital didn't actually connect Chen Pingping with Fan Xian. They just thought that it was the emperor's will, and that Chen Pingping, that loyal dog, was simply following orders. Although you always drag me around Lujing River, I don't rely on my talent to fool poor women. Fan Xian looked at the startled Li Hongqing, and laughed as he patted him on the shoulder. So I still have to scold those dog **t scholars. In his heart, Hai Tang, who had been fooled by his poetry, was not a poor woman. The two of them stood in front of Yisher Tavern, reminiscing about the past and feeling deeply moved. Inside the tavern, the shopkeepers and waiters were extremely nervous. Although they didn't know how the owner had managed to invite the Crown Prince to hold a welcoming banquet here, if Sir Fan Jr.'s first meal after returning to the capital was at Yisher Tavern, not only would the reputation of the tavern go up a notch, but in the future, rich scholars from Jiangnan would all pick this place to eat. Wouldn't that be a waste of money? Although Yisher Tavern was already famous enough, who would complain about having more of these three things? Fame, power, and money? Fortunately, they didn't have to be nervous for long. Li Hongqing and Fan Xian had already walked into the tavern, arm in arm. The guards from the prince's manor, who had been guarding the two ends of the street behind them, immediately withdrew and stood guard at the entrance of the tavern. At the same time, waiters had already led Fan Manor's carriages and attendants elsewhere. With a creak, the door to Yisher Tavern closed. This was probably the first time in the 34 years since the tavern opened in the capital. As the door closed, Li Hongqing seemed to inadvertently turn his head, and his sharp eyes discovered a few secret agents in ordinary clothing, occupying important areas around the tavern. He knew that they were the Overwatch Council's personal bodyguards, but even he wasn't sure which bureau they were from. The Crown Prince sighed to himself and said to Fan Xian, "And you say I'm arrogant? You have the Overwatch Council guarding your door when you eat, and the Tiger Guards protecting you when you go on diplomatic missions. When it comes to arrogance, I really can't compare to you." At that moment, the two of them had already ascended the stairs to the third floor. Separated by two screens, a small round table was already set up with a few plates of exquisite, cold noodles. Fan Xian didn't stand on ceremony with him. He sat down on a stool and explained, "The Tiger Guards are assigned to the diplomatic mission, and they were taken back when we returned to the capital. As for the Overwatch Council..." He laughed bitterly. "After the Nyolon Street incident, do you think the council would dare to let me wander around the capital alone?" At this point, Li Hongqing pretended to be angry and scolded him. "You're not a good person, kid. You quietly became the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Seeing how nervous the council was after the Nyolon Street incident, I think you were all ready. If it weren't for the incident at the Ministry of Justice, I would still be in the dark." Thinking about it, during the Nyolon Street incident, Fan Xian hadn't alerted the emperor with his one night of poetry. The Crown Prince was actually trying to get information out of him. It wasn't just him. Even the second prince couldn't completely understand why the emperor trusted Fan Xian so much. Fan Xian didn't explain. He wiped his hands with a hot towel and began to drink, saying that he had been away for so long that he had forgotten the taste of wine in the capital. Li Hongqing laughed bitterly. He knew that Fan Xian wouldn't explain. Not long after, the first round of dishes arrived. Knowing that the Crown Prince and Sir Fan Jr. had something to say, the waiters tactfully said nothing more and left. Fan Xian used the tip of his chopsticks to slice off a piece of fish belly and put it into his mouth. He smacked it a few times and drank a mouthful of wine.
He seemed to be enjoying it to the extreme. Li Hongqing looked him up and down and laughed. Instead of eating a first-rate bear paw, you make life difficult for a fish. You still can't escape your narrow-mindedness. Fan Xian blurted out, the bear paw is what I want, and the fish is what I want. If I can't have both, I have to give up the bear paw and take the fish. Hearing his amusing words, Li Hongqing laughed. Why? Fan Xian slapped his head and laughed. You don't understand. It's purely because you were too pedantic in your studies. Since it was a welcoming banquet, it shouldn't have been so deserted. But Fan Xian had already sent a message last night, asking the crown prince not to bring a large group of people to accompany him on the arduous journey. In addition, the crown prince faintly knew that because of the song, Fan Xian's backyard was on fire, so he didn't call for the singers to accompany him. But Li Hongqing was also a son of an influential family who was used to treating people gently. The two of them were familiar with each other. They talked about what they had seen in northern Qi, chatted, drank, and ate. It was light but satisfying. Fan Xian could finally be 70% his true self. On the contrary, he ate with great ease. After a few rounds of drinking, the crown prince couldn't take it anymore. He pointed at Fan Xian and scolded him. I heard that you drank in northern Qi and got drunk as soon as you drank. How come you're a wine immortal in front of me? Fan Xian was a master of medicine, and the zhenqi in his body was tyrannical. He couldn't be made drunk by a few cups of wine. Last time in northern Qi, when he was drinking with Hai Tang, he got drunk because he wanted to vent his years of depression. Hearing Li Hongqing's words, he laughed. You're a man. What good is it for me to get drunk in front of you? Li Hongqing suddenly looked fascinated. That Hai Tang girl. Is she really as beautiful as a fairy? He asked quietly. Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of wine. Fortunately, he spat it out quickly, and it only hit the ground. He laughed and scolded him. Could it be that you invited me to dinner today just to say this? After 3 rounds of drinking, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Li Hongqing became drunk. He pointed at Fan Xian's delicate face and said, Fan Xian, I don't know what happened to you on this trip. Looking at your face now, it's a bit different. Fan Xian unconsciously touched his face. What's different? He asked curiously. Li Hongqing scratched his head and spilled wine all over the floor. It seemed that he was thinking about how to phrase it. After a while, he laughed loudly. If you were in the past, you would have a faint smile like you do now. You would make people want to get close to you, but there would always be a barrier, as if you didn't want others to get too close to you. But now, your smile doesn't have that purposeful purity. It just makes people feel at ease, and their eyes are clear. Whether it's your speech or your actions, it's like a polished piece of jade, incomparably warm. Fan Xian smiled, fitting the scene perfectly. He thought that this was probably the change that night in the cave had brought to him. He finally understood some things. From the depths of his heart, he began to see himself as a part of this world. He began to make real plans for his future. Starting from the inside and showing it on the outside, there would naturally be changes. Li Hongqing gradually became drunk, but Fan Xian was incomparably sober. I know. Today, the palace has decided that you'll be in charge of the palace treasury. Li Hongqing seemed a little drunk. In the future, you'll have to leave some soup in your hands for me. Although it was a naughty joke, for him to say it as a prince was already giving Fan Xian enough face. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little surprised. He looked at him and quietly asked, Your family is a hereditary nobility. Why do you care about these things? Do you think the emperor owes you anything? Li Hongqing had a mocking expression on his face. He stuck out his tongue and said, You know I spend a lot. Even though there is a shopkeeper in Qingyu Hall helping the manor manage its finances, and there is some income, it is not enough. He sighed. You also know that even though my brother is the emperor's blood brother, he has not been willing to do anything all these years. Even when he enters the palace to see grandmother, it is only once a month. He is very stubborn. As an idle king, naturally there are not many people who show filial piety. And because of my status, it's not good for me to put down my pride and interact with those governors. Naturally, there will be times when I don't have the time. Fan Xian seemed a little surprised. He didn't know what to say. If this was said outside, no one would believe it. Li Hongqing waved his hand.
The smell of alcohol permeated the air.
He laughed coldly. An empty title of nobility is useless. You don't need to be embarrassed. The palace treasury belongs to the court. When it's time for you to fish, don't be shy. Think about all these years my aunt has been managing the palace treasury. Who knows how much the crown prince has benefited from it? Even when the Guo family was raided by you, they took 130,000 liang of silver. The palace treasury is empty? If you go to the crown prince's palace in Wuzhou, you'll know where the people's blood and sweat went. Fan Xian's heart jumped.
He knew that the prince's words were specifically meant for him to hear.
Looking at Crown Prince Jing, drunk on the table, Fan Xian smiled coldly. It seemed that Uncle Wu Zhu was right. There was no one in this world worth trusting. On the trip to northern Qi, he had many feelings. He knew that friendship was hard to come by. Even though he knew that Li Hongqing was using the excuse of welcoming him to represent the second prince in announcing his close relationship with the second prince to the capital, he still didn't refuse. But he didn't expect the crown prince to tell such a big lie in front of him. Li Hongqing, Crown Prince Jing, was one of Fan Xian's trusted subordinates. He had been secretly managing all the flesh business on Lujing River. Although it wasn't a glorious business and didn't seem to match the crown prince's status, it provided him with a steady stream of silver. The crown prince's actions were extremely secretive. If Fan Xian hadn't sent people to investigate Yuan Meng last summer, perhaps even the second bureau of the Overwatch Council wouldn't know about this matter. No wonder he dared to cry poor in front of Fan Xian. But Fan Xian also knew that the second prince wasn't necessarily interested in the money in the palace treasury. It was just that while the eldest princess of Xinjiang was at the helm, the Eastern Palace must have done a lot of work in the palace treasury. Perhaps the second prince was relying on Fan Xian and wanted to use this to topple the crown prince. And he also understood that there was truth in the crown prince's words. There were indeed some nobles who didn't live as they pleased. Even Fan Xian himself, if he didn't have the support of the bookstore and the head steward of the national treasury, would have to stretch out his hands everywhere. Without anyone to show him respect, did he have to rely on the government salary? The banquet was over, and the wine was finished. Fan Xian patted Li Hongqing twice. Seeing no reaction, he didn't care whether Li Hongqing was really drunk or just pretending to be drunk. He pretended to stagger, stood up, and walked out. The innkeeper had already informed the attendants on both sides to wait on him. The wooden door of Yisher Tavern opened, and the early autumn wind blew in. Fan Xian shook his head. He tried to treat his friend with sincerity, but there was no response. He couldn't help but feel disappointed. At that moment, a plainly dressed middle-aged man appeared out of nowhere, and bowed to Fan Xian in fear and trepidation. Fan Xian turned slightly and frowned. If Li Hongqing had booked the entire tavern, and there were guards outside, how did this man get in? The man saw the confusion on Fan Xian's face, and hurriedly replied humbly, "I am Xueqi, the owner of Yisher Tavern." "Greetings, Master Fan." So it was the owner of Yisher Tavern. He had probably come to flatter Fan Xian. Fan Xian was about to smile when he suddenly remembered the family name. "Chui?" he asked, frowning. Xueqi carefully smiled. "That's right. The elders of the clan wanted to come and thank you for your kindness in teaching the second son in the north. But they know that Master Fan is a scholar, and doesn't like to do things like this, so they ordered me to serve you well today." Fan Xian nodded expressionlessly. He knew that the Chui clan was a famous family with roots in the capital. They did business in the north, and Master Chui, who had knelt in the rainy night of the diplomatic mission and begged for his life, was one of them. Presumably, the Chui clan knew that their son had offended Fan Xian, and so they had done everything they could to smooth things over. Xueqi tactfully did not step forward. He only handed over a box. "This is a dwarf ginseng. Although it's not very nutritious, it's best used to sober up a hangover. It's been washed, and it's best to chew it raw." Fan Xian nodded, and Teng Zijing took it from him. In the carriage, Fan Xian opened the box on his knees. There was no dwarf ginseng, but a thick stack of banknotes. He frowned and flipped it over. There were 20,000 taels of silver in it. Teng Zijing sat across from him and said, dumbfounded, "The Chui clan is very generous." Fan Xian's expression did not change, but he was actually a little surprised. This was the income of Donbo bookstore, and yet they had delivered it so easily. Of course, he also understood that if the Chui clan still wanted to do business in the north with the palace treasury, they would have to curry favor with him.
Thinking of the courteous treatment he had received on his way out of the palace, he couldn't help but sigh. Although he had lived 2 lives, and his temperament was much firmer than that of the average person at this moment, he truly felt the feeling of power, and he felt a little lost.
But the Chui clan had given him this money for nothing. Since Fan Xian had already made up his mind, in the future, the Chui clan would only be able to accompany the eldest princess in death.
Thinking of this, his dislike for the crown prince lessened a little.
After all, people only had one life, and in the end, they were just using each other. But he did not like that Li Hongqing treated him like a fool, and in the end, he still wanted to keep this friend. Tang Zijing looked at the young master's face and knew what he was thinking. He frowned. Is this appropriate? Fan Xian looked at him and smiled.
The crown prince gave me a sentence earlier. After leaving the palace and the manor, I am a true lord.
What is inappropriate about that? The carriage arrived at a secluded alley. The moon in the sky was near its zenith, and its silvery light was soft. Fan Xian got off the carriage and let the people of the manor return first. Tang Zijing knew that Fan Xian was secretly protected by a team of Overwatch Council officials, so he said nothing. He waved at a shadow, and an Overwatch Council secret agent quietly walked over. He was also in the first batch of people from the Qinian unit, and could be considered Fan Xian's closest confidant. Fan Xian looked at him. Deng Ziyue tomorrow, send a secret order back to the council. Investigate the Minister of Appointments, the Imperial Astronomer, and the Deputy Imperial Messenger of the Left. See if they have anything to do with the Chui clan's businesses. Deng Ziyue suddenly raised his head. His eyes were wide and bright. Sir, without an edict, we cannot investigate the royal family. His rank in the Overwatch Council was extremely high, so he vaguely knew that behind these 3 officials was the second prince. Fan Xian frowned and waved his hand. It's just a few officials secretly investigating. What are you afraid of? Deng Ziyue knew that his performance had already dissatisfied the commissioner, and he hurriedly agreed. Fan Xian looked at him and added, Wang Qinian knows what to ask and what not to ask. Since you have taken over his position, you must learn this. Deng Ziyue fearfully accepted the order. Then he saw a box suddenly appear in front of him. He didn't dare open it, so he could only hold it in his arms and walk with Fan Xian, who was strolling with his hands behind his back.
Finally, he gathered his courage and asked, Sir, from now on, how can I contact the council?
He didn't know if this was something he should ask. Fan Xian stopped walking and smiled. Don't go through the official channels. That will be recorded. Go directly to Mu Tai of the First Bureau. Yes. Fan Xian walked forward. It was rare for him to appreciate the capital late at night after a long absence. He didn't want to let go of this opportunity, so he only said one sentence. This box is not for you. It's for you. Chapter 263. The nights in the capital were quieter than those in Shangjing, northern Qi. The people of the Qing kingdom were not used to the so-called Golden Age, so most of the time, they were used to staying at home at night. Of course, the pleasure boats on the Lujing River and the brothels in the west of the city were not included. Fan Xian put his hands behind his back and walked slowly through the night. Deng Ziyu held a box and followed a few steps behind him. Suddenly, Fan Xian stopped and waved his hand toward the darkness in front of and behind him. The Overwatch Council officials hidden in the darkness responsible for his safety revealed themselves somewhat unknowingly. Everyone in the capital knows you are by my side. Why deliberately stay in the dark? Fan Xian said with a smile. Deng Ziyu explained with a wry smile. The court officials do not like to see the Overwatch Council spies on the streets. The common people are also afraid. I'm afraid it will have a bad effect on you, sir. Fan Xian understood what he meant. He smiled and said, You always walk on people's roofs. Aren't you afraid you'll disturb people's sleep? The subordinates looked at each other, but they followed Commissioner Fan's orders and came to the streets. These people were all officials who had not been very successful in the Overwatch Council. When Wang Qinian was ordered to form the Qinian unit, he had put in a lot of thought and found people who were suitable. Now that the people of the Qinian unit were following Commissioner Fan, it could be said that they were riding on the crest of success in the council. No matter which of the 8 bureaus they went to do business with, they were always respectful. Furthermore, other than their monthly salary, they also received a large allowance. This kind of change made them feel that following Commissioner Fan was a very fortunate thing. It was near the middle of the night, and the temperature was dropping. Deng Ziyu hurried forward a few steps and put a thin black windbreaker on Fan Xian's body. He then immediately returned to his position. A group of 7 or 8 people walked forward. Everyone wore the black unlined clothing that the Overwatch Council had specially made. The hem was above the knee. The material did not reflect much light, and it gave off a gloomy feeling. Under the moonlight, the group maintained a very meaningful distance. Silently and synchronously, they surrounded Fan Xian in the center and walked forward. The silver light was like snow, and the black clothes were like ink. The next day, Fan Xian went to the building next to Tianhe Avenue, the Overwatch Council. As he walked in, calm-faced officials of the Overwatch Council bowed to him. "Good morning, Commissioner Fan." "Good morning, Commissioner Fan." He smiled and responded to them one by one. Without stopping, he walked towards the room at the back of the courtyard. He pushed the door open and found that the 7 heads of the 8 bureaus were all present. Fan Xian bowed slightly and cupped his hands in salute to the crowd. The 7 leaders did not dare to be arrogant and quickly stood up to return the salute. Yan Ruohai of the 4th Bureau in particular, looked at Fan Xian with an expression of joy and gratitude. It seemed that he had spent the past 2 days at home with Yan Bingyun and his son, and was in a good mood. Only Chen Pingping, sitting in the wheelchair at the end of the long table, looked at him with a faint smile. He coughed and sat on the seat to the right of Chen Pingping. He was somewhat surprised to not see his teacher. As if guessing what he was thinking, Chen Pingping gently rubbed his knees and said in a slightly sharp voice, "He went to Jiangnan to have fun. I can't control him." Fan Xian smiled and lowered his voice. Looking ahead, he said, "When are you going out to play?" Chen Pingping glanced at him and said, "That depends on when you have the ability to take over." The Overwatch Council rarely held these kinds of meetings, and Fan Xian had coincidentally run into them both times he came. Of course, these 2 meetings were inextricably linked to him. After listening to Fan Xian's report on his trip to northern Qi, the officials all relaxed. As long as the spy network in the north had not been fatally destroyed, nothing else mattered. As for Fan Xian nominating Wang Qinian to temporarily handle affairs in the north, no one had much objection. For one, Fan Xian had this power as commissioner. Secondly, Wang Qinian had been in the council for a long time. If he had not failed to live up to expectations in the beginning, he was afraid that by now he would also be a leader. Since he had coincidentally followed Commissioner Fan, it was not out of line for Commissioner Fan to promote one of his own up a rank. Third, the business in the north was a dangerous one. Just look at what happened to the son of the Yen family in the 4th Bureau. But the following announcement of the council's personnel arrangements was somewhat unexpected. The officials of the council had always thought that after Zhu Gu of the 1st Bureau committed suicide, the position that had been left empty, and the reason why the director had not called for anyone to take over was because he wanted to wait for Yan Bingyun to return to the country. Unexpectedly, the director announced that Yan Bingyun would be appointed as the head of the 4th Bureau. If he went to the 4th Bureau, who would be in charge of the 1st Bureau? What about Sir Yan Ruohai? Chen Pingping raised his eyes weakly and said, "Ruohai has been in the council for too long. He is a bit tired of it, so he has asked to resign from his position in the 4th Bureau. Tomorrow, he will send a letter to the Ministry of Appointments and find a position in the capital to enjoy his retirement." From the looks of it, Chen Pingping was not very happy about Yan Ruohai's voluntary resignation. But Yan Ruohai had been worried about his son's life every day for the past year and was actually somewhat tired of life in the council. In addition, he knew that the council's 8 bureaus could not allow 2 heads of the Yan family to appear at the same time. In order to make room for Yan Bingyun, he could only rush to resign first. The heads of the Overwatch Council's 8 bureaus did not seem to have a high rank, but in reality, they held great power in their hands. Even the vice-ministers of the various ministries did not dare to offend them. Fan Xian looked at Yan Ruohai and found that the corners of his eyes were indeed a bit tired, but there was also a hint of relief and joy. Since the director and Sir Yan had already made arrangements for the 4th Bureau, no one said anything more. At that moment, the head of the 2nd Bureau asked, "The position of the 1st Bureau has been empty for so long, someone has to take care of it." Mu Tai. He shook his head and said, "His loyalty is unparalleled, but he only knows how to flatter. His ability is still a bit weak. The First Bureau is one of the most important departments in the council, and it is in charge of supervising the officials in the capital. The other chiefs also nodded in agreement. The First Bureau was the brightest position among the 8 bureaus. Since these bosses of the 8 bureaus did not retreat bravely like Yen Ruahai, they naturally all wanted to advance further. Chen Pingping slowly turned his head and looked at Fan Xian, who still had a suspicious look on his face. He said, "From today onwards, there will be no head of the First Bureau. Commissioner Fan will have full authority to manage it." These words were spoken lightly, but they carried a heavy weight in the hearts of everyone present. Immediately, the desire to fight for power in their hearts was completely dispelled. No one dared to fight with Commissioner Fan. He had always been their superior, and it was clear that he would one day take over from Director Chen. Now that he was in charge of the First Bureau, who dared to say anything? But everyone's hearts were filled with awe. The power of the commissioner was already limited, and now that Sir Fan was in charge of the First Bureau, the affairs of the First Bureau would no longer need to be personally arranged by the council. Instead, the other departments would have to cooperate with the First Bureau. In this way, the status of the First Bureau would probably increase by half a level. In other words, Commissioner Fan was the ruler of the First Bureau. Whatever he said, the First Bureau would do. Fan Xian was also a bit surprised. Why would Chen Pingping want him to manage the First Bureau? He turned to look at him and said, "Director, I am already very reluctant to be the commissioner. I have never handled any specific affairs. If I were to suddenly manage the First Bureau, I am afraid it would not be of any benefit to the council." Chen Pingping's words set the tone. "You have no experience with specific affairs, so I am giving you the First Bureau so that you can gain some experience." After the meeting ended, all the subordinates in the council congratulated Fan Xian. But the atmosphere of the Overwatch Council was better than that of the other departments in the court, so Fan Xian didn't hear too much flattery. As the officials left, Yen Ruahai stayed behind and expressed his thanks to Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt a bit ashamed of himself. He quickly smiled and said, "Bingyun and I felt like old friends when we first met. Besides, it was all council business. I really didn't do much." "Please don't say that, Sir Yen. I am ashamed." Yen Ruahai saw that Fan Xian did not take credit for himself, and admired the young nobleman even more. He smiled and patted Fan Xian on the shoulder. "In a few days, I will send an invitation for Master Fan to visit us." Of course. Fan Xian wouldn't refuse. He also wondered what Lady Shen was like in Yen Manor. Only Chen Pingping and Fan Xian were left in the room. Nonsense station. Chen Pingping frowned and looked at him. "I know that Bingyun is a calm child, and would never bring that woman back to the capital. I think it was all your idea." Everyone was afraid of Chen Pingping, but Fan Xian always laughed and played the role of a junior in front of him. After complaining about being wronged, he said, "Director, this has nothing to do with me." When Lady Shen entered the diplomatic mission, she stayed in the eldest princess carriage the entire time. "I couldn't forcibly drag her down and kill her." Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes. "On the way back to the capital, I had the Black Knights follow the diplomatic mission. If it weren't for your instructions, how could that woman have charged into the diplomatic mission alone?" Fan Xian didn't know how to explain. After a while he sighed. At least it wasn't an ill-fated relationship. Chen Pingping loved this young man dearly, and he couldn't bear to reprimand him. "Why did you have the Qinian unit reveal their whereabouts?" Fan Xian knew he couldn't hide this from him, and he had already thought of an answer. He smiled and said, "Because I wanted the council to be more open and above board. There was no need to always hide in the dark and make so many people afraid of us." "Open and above board?" Chen Pingping frowned. "It's good that you have such thoughts." Fan Xian pulled up the blanket on his knees and said quietly, "Take your time. There's no rush." Chapter 264. Seize every moment. How can I not be anxious? Chen Pingping's thin face was expressionless. His smooth, beardless chin made the wrinkles on his face seem even deeper. He looked very old. "Remember, I am not much younger than Xiao En." Fan Xian was silent. He could smell some sort of gray aura from the old cripple in front of him. He forced himself to calm down and reported some of the secrets that had occurred on his journey, but he did not reveal that he had talked with Xiao En all night in the cave,
and that he already knew the specific location of the temple. When can Lily enter the palace? Chen Pingping seemed to be very confident in controlling that woman from 1,000 miles away. Fan Xian frowned slightly, wondering when he would be able to get in touch with Lily's brother. I'm making arrangements with some people. For the Northern Qi Court, this isn't a big deal. It shouldn't be difficult. Chen Pingping nodded. You know, the first bureau's position was originally reserved for Yan Bingyun. I didn't expect Yan Ruohai to want to retire at such a young age. Yan Bingyun has always worked for his father, and is very familiar with the fourth bureau. Staying there is not a bad choice. But the first bureau has been thrown to you. You need to be careful. Fan Xian squinted. Is there anything I need to be careful of? Chen Pingping looked into his eyes with a strange smile. There are many things you need to be careful of. In fact, His Majesty has always hoped that you would pick up the first bureau. After all, there are many officials in the capital. If you don't keep a close eye on them and let them get too close to the princes, there will always be some trouble. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He began to secretly curse that person in the palace. Your sons are making a ruckus. Why do I have to put out the fire? Chen Pingping's withered fingers gently tapped on the armrest of the wheelchair. His knuckles protruded like the joints of bamboo. Fan Xian turned to look and heard the tapping of the armrest. Only then did he realize that the armrest was hollow, just like bamboo. He couldn't help but have a strange thought. This most strict and terrifying old man in the Qing kingdom was as temperamental as bamboo in the wind? You did well in the north this time, Chen Pingping said. You had Wang Qinian stay there. I know what you want to do, but as long as His Majesty doesn't say anything, you can't make a move. Fan Xian frowned and said, The eldest princess made a lot of money from that line. You also know that I will be taking over the palace treasury after the new year. If I do not clean up this mess before I take over, I will not be able to produce results. How can I explain it to the world? Chen Pingping glanced at him and said, The Cui family sells goods to the north on behalf of the eldest princess. If you cut off this line, is there anyone suitable to take over? Fan Xian thought he had something to introduce, so he put on an expression that said he was all ears. Chen Pingping waved his hand. I will report this matter to the emperor. The emperor also feels that the eldest princess has stretched her hand too far these past few years. But, after all, we are one family. If he is not willing to relent, then you should not act. You must know that the council also hopes that you can firmly control the palace treasury. First, you are the commissioner. Second, you must know that the reason the Overwatch Council is able to maintain its current position among the 3 departments and 6 departments is inseparable from the palace treasury. Fan Xian asked, What do you mean by that? Chen Pingping glanced at him and slowly explained in a gloomy voice. The Overwatch Council has the power to supervise all officials, so it cannot have any relations with these departments. The affairs of the state and the council have always been separated. The Overwatch Council spends a large amount of money a year, but in all these years, not a single cent has been taken from the national treasury. So, whether it is the Ministry of Revenue or the other departments, they cannot order the council around. This is the so-called independence. Fan Xian understood. The Overwatch Council's funds and salaries are all directly taken from the profits of the palace treasury. Correct. Chen Pingping continued. This was an iron rule set by your mother in order to separate the council from the officials of the world. So, if you want to control the council in the future, you must plan for the thousands of officials in the council and the people on the periphery. The healthier the palace treasury, the more stable the Overwatch Council's economic foundation, and it can always maintain this independent position. Chen Pingping laughed coldly. Since the beginning of the bloodshed 13 years ago, the emperor has made who knows how many new policies. The old Ministry of Military Affairs was changed to the Council of Military Affairs, and now it is changed to the Bureau of Military Affairs. He has also re-established the Ministry of War. This is just a small example. These things in name changed again and again, seem to have no impact on the bones, but in reality, they have kneaded these departments into a big pile of dough. And the reason the Overwatch Council has always been like it was before is because of the so-called independence. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. This is all because of the emperor's words. So you must fight. Chen Pingping stared coldly into his eyes. If there is a day in the future when the palace wants to crush the Overwatch Council, you must fight. If the Overwatch Council also becomes a broken thing like the Supreme Court, then our Qing Kingdom, I'm afraid it will slowly become a broken thing like the Wei Kingdom. Fan Xian understood the old cripple's worries. He had seen more than him, and naturally understood the importance of the so-called independence of the Overwatch Council. So the Palace Treasury and the Overwatch Council have always been one and the same.
Chen Pingping said each word clearly.
Your father's thinking was really childish. To be in charge of the Palace Treasury, you must have power in your hands and firmly control this council. And to control this council, you must ensure the council's blood supply. Don't underestimate this thing called money. This small thing is enough to destroy the most tightly controlled organization in the world. Hearing him talk about his father, Fan Xian, as his son, could not say much. He could only silently accept the lesson. That day, Fan Xian went to the First Bureau and officially took up his post. The yamen of the First Bureau was not in the square, gray-black building of the Overwatch Council. Instead, it was in a courtyard next to the Supreme Court in the east of the city. The door looked solemn, but the sign on the door almost made Fan Xian spit on the face of Tang Zijing, who was acting as a coachman. He leaned against the wall of the carriage and resisted the urge to laugh. He looked at the sign, which he thought was neither fish nor fowl. The First Bureau of the Overwatch Council of the Qing Kingdom. Fan Xian suddenly felt as if time had reversed. He thought he had come to another time and space, to the door of a prosecutor's office in a city famous for its oil fields. The carriage was light, and Mu Tai had not been notified beforehand. The council's official documents had not yet been issued, so the Overwatch Council officials of the First Bureau did not know that a new leader would be arriving today. The gatekeeper looked at the carriage in front of the yamen and muttered to himself. The young man standing outside was holding his belly and laughing like an idiot. What a waste of that pretty face of his. He stood there for a long time and did not come in. What was he doing? At this time, Fan Xian had already led Deng Ziyue and a few of his trusted aides inside. Tang Zijing did not want to go in. From the bottom of his heart, he wanted to stay away from the Overwatch Council. The gatekeeper was an old man nearly 50 years old. He hurried out and stopped them. Sirs, what can I do for you?
Fan Xian was slightly surprised.
The first time he had rushed into the Overwatch Council, no one had stopped him. That was because no one else was going to wander into the Overwatch Council later.
His mind worked quickly.
Seeing the gatekeeper come to stop him, he wondered if the First Bureau had a lot of officials visiting them on a regular basis. Although he was not wearing his official robes today, Deng Ziyue and the others were still wearing the uniform of the Overwatch Council. So the gatekeeper did not know who they were, and his tone was relatively gentle. Fan Xian ignored him and walked straight in. Deng Ziyue held up his hand to stop the old man, and they walked straight into the yamen. Once inside, Fan Xian realized that the First Bureau was indeed different. Not only did no one come up to greet him, but after walking through a few rooms, he found that the rooms were empty. When it was time to be on duty, there was not a single person. He was a little confused. He found a chair in the side hall and sat down. He could faintly hear the sounds of chatter coming from the back of the yamen. There were a few officials in the Qinian unit. Coincidentally, one of them was with the commissioner today. His name was Su Wan Mao. Seeing that Fan Xian did not look pleased, he hurried to the registration room to look for the official on duty. Unexpectedly, he could not find him. Su Wan Mao was also puzzled. He had only left the First Bureau for a year. Why had the atmosphere in the yamen become so strange? Fortunately, he was an old man. Even if he could not find him, he could still find tea and hot water. He hurriedly and respectfully made a cup of tea and brought it to Fan Xian. Fan Xian was not in a hurry. He held the teacup in his hands and sipped it gently. Like the old officials in the court, he maintained his composure. Deng Ziyue glared at Su Wan Mao. What he meant was, after all this time, no one had come out. Su Wan Mao stood by Fan Xian's side, his body half bent with a bitter smile on his face. He did not dare to respond. He truly did not think that the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council would, under Director Chen's might, become like an idle yamen. The gatekeeper poked his head in from outside the door and saw that these officials were only drinking tea. He guessed that they were waiting for someone, so he didn't bother to pay them any more attention. Thus, they sat awkwardly in the middle of the hall. Fan Xian was getting impatient. He stood up and motioned for them to sit, while he walked to the cupboard at the side of the hall. He began to flip through the files that had long been covered in dust. He thought to himself that no one had come to stop him. The discipline of the First Bureau was truly broken. Suddenly, a few people walked in, talking and laughing. Looking at their uniforms, they were all officials of the Overwatch Council. In their hands, they carried large bamboo baskets. In the baskets, there were fish chilled. They looked quite fresh. When these people passed by Fan Xian's group, they did not look them in the eye. Only one of them caught a glimpse of Su Wen Mao and laughed loudly. "Old Su, how come you have time to come back today?" Su Wen Mao's face was full of awkwardness. He saw Fan Xian's hand gesture in the corner and could only smile. "Today, the commissioner is reporting to the council. We have nothing to do, so we brought you guys for a walk." On the way north, the Qinian unit knew of Fan Xian's methods. Under the pressure, they did not dare to say a word of warning. The man clapped his hands and called for the others to bring in the basket of fish. With an envious expression he said to Su Wen Mao, "Old Su, you have made a meteoric rise. If you follow that young master, won't you be able to do whatever you want in the future?" Su Wen Mao considered his words and carefully replied, "The commissioner's demands are strict. I don't dare to use his name to mess around outside." The man laughed and said, "Let's not talk about that. In any case, these good things will not fall into the hands of the First Bureau. Let's go." At the same time, he called out to Deng Ziyu's colleagues. "Since you're here, don't leave first. Everyone knows how long the meeting in the council will take. Come in with me to rub some." Deng Ziyu huffed coldly and turned his face to the side. Seeing that he did not give him face, the man's face revealed an embarrassed expression. He thought hatefully, "Isn't it just holding on to Commissioner Fan's leg? What's there to be proud about?" He paid them no more attention. After chatting with Su Wen Mao for a bit, he prepared to leave. Just then, Fan Xian walked out. With a warm expression he asked, "Brother, earlier I saw you bring in a basket of fish. Are you going to eat this for lunch?" "I'm afraid I'll have to trouble you for a meal." The light in the yamen was dim, so the man did not see Fan Xian's face clearly. He only knew that he was a young man. He laughed and said, "Of course I can't bear to eat it. We'll give it home later." "Looks like it's a valuable fish. Otherwise, it wouldn't be packed in ice," Fan Xian said. "Of course." The man squinted at Deng Ziyu and showed a proud expression. Dreamy cloud fish shipped 800 li south. They were fished from a large lake. They're incredibly delicious. If they don't keep them chilled, they would have gone bad long ago. In Jingdo, even those high-ranking officials would find it difficult to eat them. Only the military has the ability. Fortunately, we are the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such good food. So it was sent by the military. Fan Xian smiled. He knew that the various departments in Jingdo would try their best to please the First Bureau, but he didn't think they would put in so much effort. The man cupped his hands and said, "Let's not talk anymore. Since you are waiting for the commissioner's meeting to end, then please sit for a while. I'll go in and snatch my own fish, and then I'll come out to talk with you." Fan Xian said, "Don't panic. We still have something we need to see Master Mu about. It's just that we haven't been able to find him. I hope you can help us." The man looked at him and smiled. "I thought it was a big deal. I'll go inform him. You wait here." The man laughed and walked to the backyard. As soon as he left Fan Xian's line of sight, his expression changed. He jogged into a room at the back of the yamen and kicked the door open. Inside the room, there were a few people sitting at a table playing mahjong. Being disturbed like this, they jumped in fright and couldn't help but curse. Mu Tai, who was sitting at the head of the table, had an unfriendly expression on his face. He turned a green mahjong tile into a hidden weapon and threw it at the man. "Are you going to a funeral? How can a few fish make you so hungry?" The man trembled. "Master Mu, a young man has come to the bureau." Mu Tai frowned and said proudly, "What kind of person is that? If it's someone we know, then bring him here. I don't want to give up such a good mahjong tile." "I don't know him." The man's voice trembled. "But Su Wen Mao is with him. I think. Could it be that young master has come?" Mu Tai was shocked. He slammed the table and stood up. He pointed at the man's nose and scolded, You have to take responsibility for what you say. He was so frightened that he stood up and paced in circles.
Is it really the commissioner?
I think so. The man's face was full of grievance. In front of him, I didn't dare recognize him.
I pretended I didn't know him and came to inform you. If it really is Commissioner Fan, you have to be careful. Mu Tai's face was full of panic. He quickly ordered his men to remove the mahjong table and rearrange it like an office.
He jogged with the man to the front hall of the yamen. As he ran, he said, Fenger, you have done well.
Go back and ask your aunt to introduce you to a good marriage. Damn, why did the commissioner suddenly come? Thank goodness you reacted so quickly.
You are truly worthy of the first bureau of the Overwatch Council. You did not neglect your disguise work.
Good, very good.
The secret agent called Fenger wiped the ice water on his hands on the back of his clothes and said, It's Lord Mu's good leadership, good leadership.
Chapter 265. Mu Tai's face darkened, and he slowly walked out of the hallway.
Without even looking at the person sitting in the side hall, he coldly said, Who is it that insists on seeing me?
Don't you know that the first bureau is very busy?
Su Wan Mao saw that his former colleagues were always looking out for him. His eyes darted around, and he gave Mu Tai a meaningful look.
Mu Tai already knew who was coming, but he was just putting on an act.
He pretended to be reminded by Su Wan Mao, and suspiciously turned his head to look behind him. There he saw the young man.
You are. Mu Tai frowned, and took a step closer. Suddenly, he turned pale with fright, and knelt down on one knee. I am Mu Tai. Greetings, Commissioner. Fan Xian looked at him expressionlessly. He had no interest in playing along.
Mu Tai's face was still full of shock, and he happily said, Sir, why didn't you tell me you were coming to the first bureau?
I made you wait outside. What should I do?
Fan Xian still did not speak, but a smile appeared on his lips. Mu Tai looked at this smile, and his heart began to grow cold. Everyone knew that every time Sir Fan Jr. smiled the sweetest, it was also when he was the angriest in his heart. Thus, he could not help but lower his voice.
Sir,
I? Fan Xian still did not speak, and only smiled at him.
Mu Tai's dark face showed a trace of regret.
He did not dare to say anything more, and he knelt down again. In the side hall of the first bureau, the atmosphere was very oppressive.
Fan Xian did not want to see him make a fool of himself again. After all, Mu Tai was the registrar of the first bureau.
After Zhu Ji's suicide, he was basically in charge of the first bureau's affairs. He frowned and said, The side hall is too dirty.
It's not suitable for receiving guests. Mu Tai was stunned, and immediately became happy.
He angrily yelled at Fenger, Get someone to clean it up.
It's against the rules to leave the files in the hall like this. Fan Xian smiled.
Mu Tai leaped high into the air and shouted for the officials of the first bureau to come out. They began to move the dusty files into the dark room behind them.
These officials were all slacking off.
They walked out weakly and saw Master Mu standing obediently next to a young man. They did not know Fan Xian, but they were all intelligence officers. Their brains worked very fast and they immediately guessed the identity of this young man. Startled, they hurriedly went about their business. In a short while, the side hall had been swept clean, and the files were neatly organized. It looked like the first bureau of the Overwatch Council still retained their original ability to react quickly.
I'll give you an hour.
Other than those who have council business in the various departments and manors today, and those whose identities cannot be revealed, I want to see all the employees of the first bureau.
Fan Xian lifted the hem of his robe and sat down on a chair. He held out his hand, and Mu Tai placed the teacup in his hand.
Dejectedly he said, I'll go now. He knew that this young master was not easy to fool, and that his future was in Fan Xian's hands. All he could do was work seriously, hoping to reduce Fan Xian's dislike of him.
You don't have to go yourself.
It's such a small matter.
Fan Xian took his hand back and took a sip of tea.
He found that it was already cold, and he couldn't help but grin.
Mu Tai quickly reached out his hand to change it.
Fan Xian stared at him and placed the teacup on the clean table beside him.
Come with me. I have something to tell you. Mu Tai hurriedly ordered his subordinates to call back all of the First Bureau's employees, who were always out and about, while he himself followed Fan Xian to the backyard. Seeing Fan Xian step into the room he had just come out of, Mu Tai felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. Fan Xian frowned and looked at the jade mahjong tile under the threshold. This is the most powerful yamen in the Overwatch Council. Even their mahjong tiles are made of jade. Mu Tai was sweating profusely as he explained, "It's fake jade. I wouldn't dare lie to you. This is a new product made by the palace treasury 2 years ago. It looks like jade, but it won't break." Back then, one of the 8 bureaus was given a set. The first bureau set has always been in the yamen, and no one has dared to take it home. Normally, when there isn't much work to do, we play with it occasionally. I am ashamed. I hope you will punish me severely. Fan Xian shook his head. We'll talk about that later. I'm just a little disappointed that the first bureau of the Overwatch Council is so bad at hiding their tracks. Did you play mahjong here earlier? If you've already taken it, why is there another tile under the threshold? Mu Tai wiped the sweat from his forehead. He knew that this was the tile he had used to hit his nephew. When his subordinates were cleaning up the room, they must have forgotten about it. Fan Xian sat down and looked at him. Tell me, how did you become an official? It's not a big crime to play mahjong when you have nothing better to do. Mu Tai's heart skipped a beat. So none of this was a big crime.
Just as he was feeling at ease, he suddenly heard a loud bang.
He was frightened, and he looked at Commissioner Fan with a timid expression. Fan Xian slammed his palm heavily on the table. With his current strength, it would have been easy for him to smash the wooden table into pieces. But this time, he only made a loud noise.
In a cold voice he scolded, "When I saw that basket of fish earlier, I realized that you dared to take bribes from the various bureaus.
Do you want to die? If the council finds out, I'm afraid the Internal Affairs Bureau will be the first to skin you." Mu Tai hurriedly knelt in front of him. He mumbled for a long time, unable to say anything. He thought that a basket of fish was not a big deal. Fan Xian coldly scolded him. Do you think a basket of fish is not a big deal? But you must know the iron rules of the council, especially when it comes to supervising the officials in the capital. If you play with those officials like brothers, how will you supervise them in the future? Fan Xian had always seemed like a gentle person, but gentle people could occasionally get angry. His words were cold and oppressive, and it made Mu Tai feel terrified. Fan Xian looked at the official kneeling in front of him. He couldn't help but feel disappointed and surprised. Not only because of the first bureau he was about to take over, but also because of the man in front of him. Rise! According to the council's rules, there was no need to be so strict between superiors and subordinates. But Mu Tai knew that he had to maintain a proper attitude. After all, he had some history with Fan Xian. Hearing Fan Xian's words, he dared to stand up. Fan Xian looked at Mu Tai's impressive face. His lips were like thin iron, and his complexion was dark. He couldn't help but frown. In the entire capital, you are the first person to know my true identity. Mu Tai's heart sank. Last year, when he was investigating Nyolan Street, he had taken the liberty of going to Fan Manor to ask questions. At that time, the Fan household was not as popular as it was now. But this young man in front of him had revealed his identity, and he knew that he was the legendary commissioner of the council. This had been a rare opportunity. He had thought that he would have to struggle for many years, but in the end, it had all gone to Wang Qinyan's old man. In this year, you have helped me with some things, Fan Xian said, squinting. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and said, logically speaking, you should have used my connections more often, but you didn't. This made me very happy. I thought you were a sincere person. I just didn't expect that in a year, you would change so much. You went from an honest person who felt awkward even when flattering Sima Qian to the wily old bureaucrat who only knows how to muddle through life and learn to change faces. I am very disappointed. The words very disappointed made Mu Tai feel even more disappointed in himself. He knew that although he was not as close as Wang Qinian and Commissioner Fan, and he did not expect to be in charge of such a large area by himself in the past year, he had been promoted from a 7th-ranked official to a 5th-ranked official. Even if he thought with his butt, he knew that this was all because of Commissioner Fan. He took a deep breath and did not try to explain himself. He only said in a low voice, Sir, please watch my performance in the future. Fan Xian noticed that Mu Tai had changed from a lowly official to a lowly official, and he straightened his back a little.
There was a hint of admiration in his eyes. He said, "That's good."
Not everyone has the talent to be a supporting character. Don't always remember Wang Qinyan's style. You should return to being the person who was wholeheartedly investigating the case, and I will naturally not hinder your future. After the storm came the sunny weather, and after the sunny weather came the storm again. Mu Tai looked at the commissioner in front of him, thinking that this man's mind was really like the summer that had just passed in the capital. He heard Fan Xian ask in a low voice, "Tell me, how did this place become so rotten? I've been to the other places in the council, and they can't compare. The officials in the other places are all cautious and conscientious. Not to mention playing mahjong, even going out to pay their respects has to be rushed, and there's no wind. Look at this place. What's the difference between this and a wet market?"
Mu Tai had already thrown caution to the wind. He wanted to be himself again, and he wanted to cling to Sir Fan Jr.'s thick thighs. He did not hide anything and directly said, "Sir, I cannot escape the blame for the first bureau becoming like this. But for the past year, there has been no official to manage it, and the people below me do not accept me, so naturally they have become lax." Fan Xian was very clear on this matter. Back then, the head of the first bureau, Xueqi, secretly relied on Xinyang and leaked information about Yan Bingyun, which led to Yan Bingyun's arrest in the north. Later, the council investigated, and Xueqi failed. He committed suicide in a secret room during the council's joint conference. This was one of the most sensational events since the founding of the Overwatch Council. Since that day, the first bureau had been without a head. One reason was that Chen Pingping wanted to wait for Yan Bingyun to return, and the other was that the position was very sensitive. Secretly monitoring all the officials in the capital, if this kind of power was used, it could bring many benefits. At the time, the council did not have a suitable candidate, so it had been delayed. Even if there was no official to manage it, the rules and regulations have always been there. Why is no one doing anything? Has the council never reprimanded you? Fan Xian asked, somewhat puzzled. Mu Tai also didn't understand. He shook his head and continued, "Sir, you said that the rules are there. But if we want the first bureau to do something, the council has to issue an order. Without a head to speak, we ordinary officials can't find our own excuses, so we go to the manners of the vice ministers and scholars."
Fan Xian was startled. He said angrily, "Did the second bureau not send any intelligence over this past year?" "They did." Mu Tai looked at him. "But according to the laws of the Qin Kingdom, we have no right to investigate officials above the third level. We have to ask for an edict, or at least get the approval of the director." Fan Xian said helplessly, "You can't touch anyone above the third level for now. What about those below the third level?"
Mu Tai replied, "Sir, I dare not hide this from you. Although the first bureau is the most important department in the council in name, in reality, it has always been the most incompetent department. The reason is very simple. The second and third bureaus only deal with intelligence, poisons, weapons, and such inanimate objects. The fifth and sixth bureaus are responsible for security, the seventh bureaus deal with criminals, and the eighth bureaus deal with books. Of the 8 bureaus, only the first bureau and the fourth bureau deal with people, and the fourth bureau's energy is mainly focused on foreign countries and the provinces. Who would dare to compete with the people of the fourth bureau? They could just find a random excuse to remove the county magistrates. Who would dare to say anything?" At this point, he couldn't help but laugh at himself. "We, the first bureau, are deep in the capital. We look impressive, but in reality, the people we deal with are the officials of the court and the local officials of the capital. In terms of status, they are more respected than we are. In terms of status, the officials of the capital see the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, so it's natural for them to be friendly to us. If the 6 bureaus have something to gain, they won't forget about us. But if they really want to compete, they won't be afraid of us." Fan Xian thought this wasn't right. Where in his previous life had he heard of such a cowardly brocade guard?
For those below the third level, you have the right to file a case and conduct independent investigations. If they are afraid of you, they will try to please you. Why would they dare compete with you?
Mu Tai laughed at himself.
"Sir, those officials may be below the third level, but what about their teachers? These officials have long ago woven a big net all over the capital. Some cases, even if we find evidence, can't be reported.
Fan Xian squinted and asked, "Why?"
It's simple. The brothers of the first bureau also have to live in the capital. Mu Tai sighed. Although the salary is much higher than that of ordinary officials, the relatives of the family still have to find a way to make a living. They find jobs in the various yamen. Even if you don't deal with these officials, even if you sell vegetables, if you investigate a scribe in the capital government, the capital's magistrate will have the ability to shut down your vegetable stand. The reason he uses is very much in line with the laws of the Qing kingdom. You can't find any fault with it. As for those who are connected to the palace, they won't even look at us. Like Dai Zhan of the Vegetable Inspection Bureau in Dengshi, he is a well-known corrupt official, but we can't touch him. Why? Because eunuch Dai of the palace is his uncle. Ever since Master Zhu committed suicide to escape punishment, the first bureau has no one to lead them. The officials under him won't easily offend the officials in the capital. Who doesn't have relatives? We're all in the bureaucracy, so we have to leave some room to meet in the future.
Mu Tai said with shame, "I'm not afraid of your anger, sir.
This year, I've been trying to protect myself. Other than the big cases handed down by the council, I haven't investigated anything else. Sir, it's not that I don't have the guts, it's just that living in the capital is not easy. There are too many officials that I have to deal with." Fan Xian didn't say anything. He calmly said, "From now on, talk to me like this. Rectification. The first thing to be rectified is that people don't do practical things. They only know how to please their superiors." Hearing the term rectification was new to Mu Tai, he felt an inexplicable sense of fear. He quickly asked Fan Xian for instructions. After a while, Fan Xian spoke expressionlessly.
Mu Tai listened with a look of admiration.
He was afraid that he would forget, so he ground the ink and scribbled. After some time, Deng Ziyu finally knocked on the door and reported, "Sir, everyone is here."
In the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, other than the people who had stayed behind to guard the capital, there were 310 members in total. Other than those who were investigating the case and the spies buried in the manners of the officials, everyone who could come was basically all present. They took up an entire piece of flat ground in the back courtyard. Everyone had already tidied up their clothes and stood solemnly, waiting for the commissioner to speak to them. Fan Xian sat in a chair in front of everyone. He had no intention of standing up. He looked at these people and nodded slightly. He realized that a year of laxity had not completely worn away the solemn atmosphere around these people. He could still smell a trace of the gloominess of the Overwatch Council spies. He was quite satisfied with this. Mu Tai leaned forward and whispered in his ear, "The first bureau is a bit special. The spies here are not secret. Everyone here has revealed their identities. Most of them are still in hiding. The spies' names are kept in the yard and cannot be accessed. If you want to see them, you will need the first bureau's report and the director's warrant." He thought of Fan Xian's status and paused. "You are the commissioner, so you do not need the director's warrant. But you will need the first bureau's report. I will write it in a bit." Fan Xian shook his head. After a moment of silence, he smiled. "There is no need. From today onwards, I will be in charge of the first bureau. If you want me to write a report, I will have someone write it." Mu Tai's body stiffened. He had thought that Fan Xian was only here for an inspection. He did not expect that he would be in charge of the first bureau.
But when he thought of the fact that he could work with Fan Xian in the future, and that it would be easier to get close to him, a trace of joy appeared on his face. There was a long silence on the flat ground. Fan Xian did not say anything. The hundreds of members of the first bureau stood in the same posture as if they were javelins. Although they were not soldiers, their uniform black was still very pleasing to the eye. It gave off the feeling of Scotland Yard on a rainy day. After a long time, Fan Xian stood up and quietly said, "I am Fan Xian. From today onwards, I will be your chief official." Most people had guessed who he was, but when they heard that the world-famous Sir Fan Jr. was coming to the first bureau as a chief official, they were slightly surprised, but more than that, they were happy. After Zhu Ji's death, not only did the first bureau find it difficult to carry out its work in the capital, they were even looked down upon by the council. Now, with Sir Fan Jr. taking the lead, who else in the other 7 bureaus would dare to make excuses? The various departments and yamens in the capital would probably offer even more benefits in secret. But what Fan Xian said next sent a chill down everyone's spine. I know how you have spent the past year, Fan Xian said with a smile. From today onwards, you can no longer live like this. After throwing out this simple conclusion, he sat back in his chair and glanced at Mu Tai. Mu Tai stood up and coughed twice.
He looked at his subordinates in a very dignified manner and said, "Today, I have gathered everyone here mainly because the commissioner has some things to say at the beginning of his term.
I have been entrusted by the commissioner to say a few words. The main idea was decided by the commissioner. Please listen carefully, my colleagues." The officials in the council listened attentively. Today, I would like to talk about the style of the first bureau.
Mu Tai furrowed his brows and said bitterly, "Why is there an Overwatch Council?
Why do we have the first bureau?
Because there are corrupt officials in the court who lie to His Majesty, oppress the people, and violate the laws of the Qing Kingdom. His Majesty wants to supervise the government, the people want to live and work in peace, and the dignity of the Qing Kingdom's laws must be upheld.
So, there must be a bureau." The officials were stunned. Sir Mu had always been good at handling cases. When did he learn to write such articles about officialdom? But with His Majesty, the people, and the Qing Kingdom's laws weighing down on them, no one dared to say anything.
"We are the first bureau. We are His Majesty's eyes and ears. If we want to be able to hear and see well and share His Majesty's burden, we must be in sync. Our troops must be strong, and our orders must be carried out like a mountain. Otherwise, the supervision of the officials in the capital would be like a castle in the air.
What are the problems in the first bureau today?
His Majesty's instructions are wise and correct, and the first bureau's work has been fruitful. In this regard, the commissioner has praised us greatly."
Mu Tai's tone suddenly changed, and he said coldly,
"But, in the past year, there have been many problems in the first bureau. As the acting supervisor, I am responsible. Tomorrow, I will ask for punishment. But from today onwards, you are not allowed to do anything that violates the rules of the Overwatch Council. You are not allowed to privately or in the name of the first bureau, to accept gifts and benefits that can be converted into money from other departments of the court. You are not allowed to refuse any reports for any reason. You are not allowed to have daily contact with officials of any departments under any name. If a case requires a banquet, you must report in advance, and the minimum number of guests must be at least 3. Increase the organization of the routine work and strengthen. Strictly implement the rules of the Overwatch Council and the relevant rules. In the past year, if you have done anything inappropriate, please report to me within 10 days, and I will forgive you." Mu Tai was still talking incessantly, but the officials of the first bureau grew nervous. They did not know that this was the so-called rectification movement, but they could tell that if Commissioner Fan really did go all out, they would never be able to get the benefits they had earned this year again. Furthermore, they would have to throw themselves back into the dangerous and glorious work of offending the officials of the capital. Everyone could not help but look embarrassed and resentful. Even so, they still did not whisper or retort. They did not behave like the officials of the 6 ministries. Although their expressions fluctuated, they still stood firmly with great control. The Overwatch Council, which Chen Pingping had single-handedly trained, was, in terms of foundation and essence, the most solid spy team in the world.
Mu Tai finished speaking. Fan Xian stood up and put his hands behind his back.
He smiled and said, "If you have any opinions, say them now." The crowd was silent. The difference between the status of the ordinary secret agents and investigators of the Overwatch Council and Fan Xian, who was favored by the heavens, was too great. No one dared to argue in front of him. Fan Xian smiled and tried to draw the snake out of its hole.
"It's a collective brainstorming. The director has sent me to the first bureau because he thinks highly of my colleagues. You all know that I am busy, and I can't be bothered to go to a normal yamen." After he said this, the officials in the court relaxed a little. It was rumored that Commissioner Fan hid a dagger behind his smile, but at this moment, they could not see it. He was of noble birth and was a world-famous scholar. How could he be proficient in the dirty work of the Overwatch Council? They agreed for now, and would think about it later.
They all bowed and said, "As you command, Commissioner Fan."
Fan Xian frowned, a little dissatisfied. Mu Tai was close, and he could see the coldness in Fan Xian's eyes.
He thought Fan Xian was dissatisfied that his subordinates did not appear to be loyal. Worried,
He quickly gave Fenger, who was standing in the front row, a look. This person was his distant nephew, also surnamed Mu. Mu Fenger saw his uncle's look and thought he wanted him to stand up and object, but how could he dare say no to the commissioner? His heart was filled with fear, and his legs trembled. In the end, he remembered the kindness his uncle had shown him. He steeled his heart, gritted his teeth, and stood out of the line of soldiers. Without any hesitation, he saluted and said, "Commissioner, although the position of the First Bureau is to supervise the officials in the capital, it is difficult to avoid social interactions. Everyone has relatives, such as my brother-in-law, who is currently working in the Cavalry Bureau. If I do not interact with him on a daily basis, that is fine, but I am afraid that my fierce wife at home will not stop arguing." These words seemed mischievous, but no one dared to laugh. No one knew why Mu Fenger was so bold today. Fan Xian was happy, but his face was gloomy. In a cold voice, he scolded, "Do you think the rules of the council are a pile of dog shit that you can slap on your face however you want? The rules have long been made clear that relatives within 3 generations are not included after they have been registered. If you insist on saying this, is there something wrong? Mu Tai, drag your distant nephew away and serve him according to the rules." Mu Tai sighed and dragged his nephew away with a face full of resentment to be flogged. Fan Xian's cold gaze swept across the crowd. "Is there anything else you want to say?" Everyone knew he was using his official power to oppress people, but they did not expect there to be a stubborn person among the secret agents. They stood out and bowed in a low voice. "Commissioner, investigating cases is what we should do, but what if we are threatened by nobles? What if we encounter officials making things difficult at home? What if the eunuchs in the palace speak?" There was silence. What the First Bureau feared most when investigating cases was running into officials with connections to the palace. No matter how powerful the Overwatch Council was, they were still just thugs raised by the palace. Fan Xian looked at him calmly and said, "Say my name." These 5 words were loud and clear. "Whoever dares to make things difficult for you, regardless of whether they are officials or nobles, just say my name." In the present Jingdo, Fan Xian indeed had the confidence to say such words. Even if the people in the palace still showed a glimmer of pride in front of him, if it came down to it, probably none of the third-level officials or nobles would dare to take the risk of offending Fan Xian and bully his subordinates. With the power of the Overwatch Council in his left hand and the wealth of the world in his right, who would want to offend Fan Xian? Fan Xian looked at the official who had stepped out and felt some admiration. After he had deliberately suppressed Mu Tai, the official still dared to stand out and speak. Thinking of this, he slowed down and said gently, "What other opinions do you have? Say them all. I will not punish you." The official actually had nothing more to say. He braced himself and said, "I believe that it is only natural that individuals do not accept money. But it is fine to accept some in the name of the First Bureau. On one hand, it is better to have a good relationship with the 6 ministries. In the future it will be easier to investigate cases. On the other hand, after the money is distributed, it can be considered a supplement." Fan Xian looked at the people in the council. He knew that these people also cared about the money. He couldn't help but laugh coldly. "In terms of salary, you all receive 3 times more than the court officials of the same rank. Although you are not as rich as the court officials, this was the original intention of the council when it was founded. What is there to complain about?" Su Wan Mao, who had been standing behind him the entire time, boldly said, "The Overwatch Council has always suffered the backlash of the officials and the disdain of the people. The First Bureau is in a special situation, and the court is not willing to subsidize it, so—" Fan Xian shook his head and stopped him from speaking. He looked calmly at the Overwatch Council secret agents and officials present. He waited until the atmosphere had been squeezed until it was incomparably silent. Only then did he say, word by word, "Don't ask what the court has done for you. Ask yourself what you have done for the court." Su Wan Mao was stunned. After thinking about it for a while, he realized that there was a deeper meaning to it. He couldn't help but feel a sense of shame and admiration. Yes, when the officials of the First Bureau were planning for themselves, did they ever think about why the court had established the Overwatch Council? The official who had stepped out to speak was also stunned. After so many years of education and influence from the council, and Chen Pingping's admonition, it seemed that he had returned to the state of mind he had when he first stepped into the council. His heart warmed, he clenched his right fist and shouted, "Everything for the kingdom of Qing!" Everything for the kingdom of Qing. This was the motto that everyone present had to remember on their first day in the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian looked at the scene and smiled with relief.
He clenched his right fist and said to himself, "Everything for life."
Chapter 266. The sky was dark. All of Jingdo was enveloped in a gloomy and somber atmosphere. The refreshing autumn air had disappeared. The cold rain that had continued for 3 or 4 days not only washed away the dust in the roof tiles of the private residences, but also washed the stone pavement clean. At the same time, it also brought the first chill of autumn in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. Fan Xian rubbed his hands together and sat on the second floor of Xinfeng restaurant. His gaze pierced through the layers of rain outside the window and looked at a yamen across the street.
A little further in that direction was the yamen of the Supreme Court.
Comparing the two yamens, the first bureau appeared much quieter. However, the expressions of the Overwatch Council officials who went in and out were steady. They were no longer the same as before. The rectification had been going on for a few days. Of course, Fan Xian did not think that just shouting a few slogans and reiterating the rules would be enough to bring back the minds of all the officials. So, the secret self-examination and investigation had continued. After ruthlessly removing some people from their positions, and at the same time, even more ruthlessly sending some officials to the 7th Bureau for trial, the atmosphere in the 1st Bureau finally changed. The yamen, which was as precise as a machine, finally began to operate effectively. Fan Xian was not used to sitting in the 1st Bureau, so he refused Mu Tai's offer of a room. Instead, he booked a quiet room facing the street on the 2nd floor of the famous Xinfeng restaurant. Every day, he would sit there and eat some snacks to kill time. At the same time, he could ensure that if something happened in the 1st Bureau, he would be able to react immediately. There was a steamer on the table in front of him. In the steamer about the size of 2 palms, there was a single steamed bun. From this, one could tell that this steamed bun had a thin skin and a large stuffing. It was indeed not small, and the white surface was filled with a delicious oil that was about to overflow, making one feel a little envious just by looking at it. He blew gently on the bun and used his chopsticks to unfold the longan, revealing the freshly oiled broth inside. Fan Xian took a tube of wheat straw and tilted his head. "Do you want some soup?" "Hut." Fan Xian smiled and used his chopsticks to open the eyes. He picked out the meat filling that had been soaked in the soup for a long time and had already started to taste. Using a small plate, he placed it into the bowl of the person beside him and coaxed, "De bao is the best. This soup is hot, but the meat is not. However, you still need to blow on it a bit." De bao was very obedient. Puffing his cheeks, he blew at the meat in the bowl with all his might. Tiger, tiger, tiger. Ever since his father-in-law had resigned and returned home, the Lin Manor had become deserted. When Fan Xian was in northern Qi, De Bao spent most of his time in the manor. After he came back, he didn't see De Bao for a few days. He couldn't help but feel suspicious. After asking Wan he found out that she thought he had just returned, so she sent De Bao back to the Lin mansion. Fan Xian was not happy to hear this. Although others would not dare to make things difficult for Lin Manor for his sake, the servants in Lin Manor were the most cunning characters. Right now, Lin Manor was only looked after by Wanner's distant relatives. How could he be at ease? Unfortunately, after he took over the 1st Bureau, he had been busy for many days and did not have time to deal with this matter. Taking advantage of today's rain and there was nothing to do in the capital, he called Deng Ziyu to bring De Bao out from the Lin mansion and sit with him in Xinfeng restaurant to taste the restaurant's most famous Jetong buns. After a while, they would return to the mansion. "Stop boasting. You can eat now." Fan Xian chuckled and looked at his brother-in-law. For some reason, De Bao, who had the intelligence of a child, was especially obedient to Fan Xian's words. He quickly lowered his head and swallowed the meat in one gulp. Seeing how anxious he was, Fan Xian didn't know if he tasted it or not. Seeing this scene, Fan Xian couldn't help but think of Zhu Beiji eating ginseng fruit. He couldn't help but laugh. Deng Ziyu sat at another table. Seeing this scene, he couldn't help but feel a little strange. The Qinian unit that followed Fan Xian had a total of 30 people. They were divided into 4 squads to protect him. After Deng Ziyu took over Wang Qinian's position, he followed Fan Xian closely. So, he knew what Fan Xian had been doing these past few days. He thought to himself that the commissioner he followed was really an enigmatic person. After rectifying the atmosphere of the first bureau, he didn't give any specific instructions for a long time. Instead, he just stayed in Xinfeng restaurant every day to eat good food and listen to folk songs. For someone of Fan Xian's status to be so attentive to his retarded brother-in-law, Deng Ziyu was a little surprised and a little impressed. The sound of footsteps came from downstairs. Deng Ziyu immediately woke up from his idle thoughts. His hand tightly gripped the pedao at his waist. His eyes were like an eagle's, staring at the stairs. The person who had come was Mu Tai. These days, he had been in charge of corrective work in the first bureau. He had to examine the subordinates who were suspicious, and at the same time, he had to maintain everyone's morale. He also had to deal with the task that Fan Xian had secretly given him. He was so busy that he didn't even have time to stroll around the building. His eyes were sunken, and there was an unhealthy gloominess on his dark face. Mu Tai took off the rain hat on his head, unbuttoned his raincoat, and threw it in the corner of the room. He carefully took out a cylinder from his bosom. He didn't know what material the cylinder was made of, but it was obviously waterproof, because the paper he pulled out from inside the cylinder was not wet at all. Fan Xian took it and carefully examined it line by line. His eyebrows gradually furrowed, and his face became gloomy. When he first returned to the capital, he had Deng Ziyu investigate the officials who were related to the second prince, to see if they had anything to do with the Cui family. Later, he took over the first bureau, and this task was directly given to Mu Tai. It was a test for him. There didn't seem to be any strong evidence on the paper, but this was what he had expected. The other party must have done it very cleanly, but it seemed a little too cleanly. Could it be that the Cui family, as big as they were, had not given any tributes to the Minister of Appointments and the Imperial Astronomer all these years? Fan Xian sighed in his heart and asked, "Everything is here?" Mu Tai nodded. Fan Xian asked again, "Did the second bureau ask anything?" Mu Tai looked at him and shook his head. "The second bureau is very cooperative, and they only think it's an order from the council. They don't know that it's the commissioner's will. Please don't worry, I can guarantee that no one knows." "There's no information from the second bureau?" Fan Xian realized that he was still holding the chopsticks in his hand. He knew that he was a little nervous about this matter. He laughed at himself and put the chopsticks on the side of the steamer. His biggest enemy now was the eldest princess, who was far away in Xinjiang. No one knew when she would return to the capital, so he had to confirm that, after the crown prince and the eldest princess gradually drifted apart, who the princes in the court were, and who was on the same side as the eldest princess. Mu Tai's tone was still respectful, but with a hint of confidence. Although the second bureau is responsible for intelligence work in the capital, their sources are not as good as the first bureau's. "Please don't worry, sir." Fan Xian nodded, indicating that he could leave. After Mu Tai left, Fan Xian looked at the small, densely packed words on the file and fell into deep thought. It recorded all the people the Cui family had bribed over the years, the time and the reason. Most of the officials in the capital had connections, but there was no trace of the second prince's faction. This gave him a headache. His intuition told him that there was a problem, but he couldn't find anything useful in this complicated information. In reality, Fan Xian knew very well that his forte lay in assassination, holding power and creating momentum. In the end, under the gentleness on the surface, he only had the heart of an assassin. He was not an emperor who was good at controlling and manipulating people's hearts. He was also not a strategist who was good at analyzing intelligence and judging strategies. Knowing one's weaknesses and using one's strengths, Fan Xian used people in this way and analyzed himself in this way. Thinking of that meticulous plan in Shangjing, northern Qi, he couldn't help but sigh. He began to think of Wang Qinian, who seemed funny, but had actually helped him come up with many ideas. Of course, the true mastermind of that plan was Yan Bingyun. Fan Xian had originally planned to tie him to his belt after he returned to the capital. Who would have thought that the council would send Yan Bingyun to the fourth bureau and leave him in charge of the first bureau? It was no easy task to squeeze Sir Yan Jr.'s intelligence and strategy from an official point of view. He glanced at Debao and found that his brother-in-law was launching a final attack on a bowl of mixed paste noodles. He couldn't help but smile. Picking up the steamed bun skin that had lost its meat filling, he reached into Debao's bowl and carelessly smeared some meat sauce on it. Then, he quickly stuffed it into his mouth and began to chew in large mouthfuls. Debeo was stunned.
He realized that a hand had brushed past his bowl.
It took him a while to react. He slowly raised his head to look at Fan Xian, who was full of pride. He shook his head with some bitterness, then lowered his head to eat the noodles. Outside Xinfeng restaurant, the rain continued to fall. The force of the rain was great. After it hit the ground, it bloomed into countless balls of mist, gradually blurring people's eyes and obscuring the buildings around the street. A chill followed the raindrops and landed in Jingdo. It blew against the group of people in front of Xinfeng restaurant's door, wanting to burrow into their necks and borrow their warmth. Fan Xian draped a windbreaker over Debeo's body and carefully fastened the buckle around his neck. Only after confirming that the cold wind wouldn't enter did he relax and pat his shoulder. Xian has to do some things. Debeo can go back to the manor and play with Wanner first, okay? Debeo was chewing on an apple.
He vaguely nodded his head and said, "My sister is too fierce."
Fan. Fatty will play. Fan Xian understood what he meant and laughed out loud.
He thought to himself, if all the officials, merchants, husbands, prostitutes, and poets all had a simple and peaceful heart like Debao, perhaps his own life would be much simpler and more relaxed.
He carefully said a few words to Tang Zijing.
The Fan Manor carriage took the young uncle back to the manor. Deng Ziyu glanced at Fan Xian and asked in a low voice, "Sir, where are we going at this time?"
To Yan Manor. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.